Right, so you're at a party fundraiser. You're pressing the flesh, schmoozing those who donate to your party, and you have a Palestinian man stand up and try to tell you about the family he's just lost in Gaza. What would you do? Listen to him? Console him? Sympathise with him for his losses and the circumstances he's lost his family in. Certainly if you have an ounce of empathy in your body. But if you're Angela Rayner, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, some on the left, especially those still clinging to their Labour membership card, still believe is a lefty, though I question what you hope to achieve there anymore if you are still hanging in there, then your reaction is to say thank you whilst Greater Manchester Police grab this said person by the scruff and bodily throw him out. Most everyone else in attendance just sat there and looked on impassively in silence at the spectacle before them. Does that sum up the typical Labour member and donor these days? Police state antics conducted before their eyes and they just sit there in silence? As for Rayner, if this incident doesn't finally make you realise her socialist credentials are about as strong as Keir Starmer's are, then I'm not sure what will. Right, so Angela Rayner, dead-eyed Ange, was in Stockport on her home turf with Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds at a party fundraiser, there to give speeches, be seen, be heard, in order to raise money that Labour sorely needs, having lost so many members, and the old Blairite dinosaur donors that have returned aren't coughing up quite as much as needed, though they have very definitely been coughing up, having bought themselves Keir Starmer some time ago. But then a protest began, and it started with one chap who has lost his family in Gaza, confronting both Rayner and Reynolds about their failure to call for an end to the genocide. And well, here's the clip that's been doing the rounds of social media. See what you make of it.
Thank you. Thanks, Johnny. And look, Tameside's going to save the world. That's why us three are up here. But
the change in this country, it has come when you take the place and asking and demanding for ceasefire. I lost my family in Gaza. Just a second, I want to show you my mom. I lost my family in Gaza. If the ceasefire takes place,
I just say, you tell yourself as a feminist. What kind of feminist are you?
I lose 5 members. I need my mom. That's the only thing I need.
Where's your voice,
Let me finish. I need my mom. Why are you not demanding for the ceasefire?
15,000 women and children dead, Angela Rayner, and you tout yourself as a modern-day feminist? I don't think so.
thank you.
Women having to use scraps, tents for sanitary towels. Where's your voice, Angela? Call yourself a feminist?
Thank you.
I really don't think so.
Jonathan Reynolds,
thank
you talk about
Raising genocide!
talk about
Raising genocide! You should be ashamed of yourself, Angela Rayner.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
your vice chair of
Thank
Labour
you.
Friends of Israel. Your friendly
Thank
Israeli
you.
president said he was waging,
You've
his
made
country
your
was
point,
waging
thank
a
you.
war against barbaric jihadists who wanted
Thank
to
you,
take
you've
over
made your
Europe.
point,
Jonathan
thank you.
Women dead every day, Angela. 2 women dead every day. 25,000 people dead, Angela, and rising.
Shame!
Where's your voice?
Shame on all of you!
Shame on all of you. Absolute shame.
You say you want
Shame.
you support it.
Funding genocide.
You're funding genocide. 25. You abstained from the vote against your peace. Shame on you.
Shame.
25,000 people.
Shame on you all. And get your hands off her as well.
You're pushing me. Hands off me.
Disgusting.
Hands off me. You're not the hands me out. Your hands off me. Get off me. You're hurting me. You're hurting me. No, get off me. No, get off me. Don't hurt me. Get off me. You're wasting my wrist. You're breaking my wrist. I didn't say it. You're breaking my wrist.
Thank you.
I'm not sure whose conduct I'm more disgusted by there, actually. The politicians or those in attendance just watching it all unfold. Watching some real heavy-handedness going on. Not just in the way the Palestinian man was forcibly removed by the scruff by a police officer far bigger than he was, or the way the same officer manhandled a woman out near the end of the clip. How could anyone just sit there and watch that? Nobody moved. Nobody spoke out to help people protesting a position which is already bringing Labour serious amounts of condemnation. But then there's Rayner's response, which I found interesting too, in that she was clearly completely disinterested. All she could do was say thank you and that the people protesting had made their point. Her hand barely left her hip throughout the entire interruption to her planned evening of seeking donations. Totally impassive, cold, unfeeling. It's little wonder that dead-eyed Ange moniker sticks to her so well. Labour, let us not forget, is the party of protest. It was formed through protest, through workers' rights, through trade unionism, through solidarity, and there is absolutely zero sign of any of that left in this modern Labour Party, which is just another Tory party now, wooing donors just like the Blue Team does, instead of being debt-free and free of influence bought by said donations, as we saw under the previous Labour administration, completely funded by ordinary working-class people, giving a fiver there or a tenner here, as the Labour Party was meant to be. Instead of calling out the genocide, the party of Starmer and Rayner have refused to back a ceasefire, have backed attacks on the Houthis in Yemen, who are attacking Israeli and Israeli-bound shipping, and have enabled this sickening assault on Gaza to persist, staying in lockstep with the US as they dictate our foreign policy, and clearly that won't change with a change of government to a Starmer-led one, will it? But Angela Rayner, heck, so many people still thought she was better, didn't they? She stuck with Corbyn. She was one of his, wasn't she? But surely by now you can see she never was. She's just like Starmer, in it for themselves. Both rode on Corbyn's coattails, gained position and privilege through that, and looked on as he got proverbially thrown under the bus. What more proof do you need of this? She's not called this the genocide. She's in an elected position where she can hold Starmer accountable without fear of being sacked, but chooses not to. There's an argument by some that she's positioning herself for a tilt at the leadership herself, but given what she's prepared to sit on her hands over to get there, what kind of leader do you honestly think she'd be? She stood there saying thank you impassively, flatly, her voice not even trying to feign interest, I don't think, as a literal police state action unfolded in front of her, tossing out the very people the Labour Party was created to stand by, stand up for, those facing oppression, standing up for the little guy. The Labour Party wasn't already dead to you. It should have died before your eyes in that room. The audience, the faces of those Labour seats the support of today just sat there, doing nothing, as politicians watch on, also doing nothing, as those facing oppression and wanting to get their point across and their stories told get further oppressed. What makes them any different to the Tories here? That is exactly the sort of reaction you expected a Tory to give. The police handling was so over the top, it was, in my opinion, assault. But Rayner is so vocal online, some of you might say, calling out all the manner of Tory awfulness. And to that I would say, look at her in that room as assault is happening before her eyes. People whose families are the victims of genocide are stood before her and watch her as they get forcibly removed. She doesn't bat an eyelid, she couldn't give a stuff, and of course Twitter has had its say on this. Stats for Lefties wrote, pro-peace activists disrupted a lavish Labour fundraiser tonight, calling for a Gaza ceasefire. One Palestinian told attendees that Israel killed his family. He was dragged out by police as Angela Rayner and Labour supporters sat in silence. Jill King wrote, they physically manhandled a man whose family were killed in Gaza out of the room. A party who one would expect to stand in solidarity with the oppressed. A party that one time would have spoken out against injustice. Why bother fundraising? Who are they for now? Edwina Murphy said, Labour will never get my vote whilst Angela Rayner, Lisa Nandy and Keir Starmer are in post. As women, they make me sick. Her condescending thank yous reveals the depravity and arrogance. Shameful women. Feminist my arse to support what Israel are doing to Palestinian women. And Amani T wrote, what hurts the most is how this man who lost his family was tackled instead of embraced. The whole room should have stood for him. What a world. Couldn't agree more with the sentiment of that last tweet. So many of us have nothing but sympathy and empathy for the innocent people of Gaza being slaughtered in the tens of thousands that we see on our social media every single day. Many of them women and children. The majority of them, in fact, have been women and children. But the level of couldn't care less attitudes amongst politicians, and Labour especially, shows how far they've fallen. And in many estimations, Angela Rayner has fallen further than most. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, if Keir Starmer can make up his mind on whether he actually supports Palestinian statehood or not, that might help Labour politicians position themselves. And whilst you might have a point, Starmer has flip-flopped on this at least 3 times now. That doesn't preclude Rayner from having an original thought of her own, though to understand her possible confusion, not to mention ours, as regards Labour's position, you only need realise Starmer moves from one populist position to the next at the drop of a hat because he has zero integrity. But do watch this video here next to see just what a balls up Starmer is making of this issue for his party, all on his lonesome, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so The extent to which the Labour Party is in hock to Israel and the Israel lobby is frankly obscene and is getting put under the microscope by a great many more would-be voters in an election year right now. But today, on Holocaust Memorial Day, they've gone above and beyond to demonstrate this fact. The worst possible time they could, really. It's literally been a day since the International Court of Justice ruled there was a prima facie case of genocide to consider further against Israel. And not only does the Labour Party put out on its official Twitter account a message of remembrance for Holocaust Memorial Day, but they also cite several other genocides too. Very much except the one we're seeing unfold before our eyes right now. Is that because Starmer, through his words and deeds, is too complicit? Are his feet too close to this particular fire? Well, any Labour MP who have dared to refer to Gaza as part of this period of remembrance has been forced to publicly apologise for doing so. That might well be the case, but also reinforces the belief of many that the Labour Party are to all intents and purposes an extension of the Israeli state these days. So who is this country going to be running the interest of if Keir Starmer ends up in charge in the near future? Right, so Labour's Twitter message on Holocaust Memorial Day, omitting any mention of Gaza, just a day after the International Court of Justice's ruling against Israel in the favour of South Africa and Palestine, with the imposition of court orders that amount to a ceasefire to all intents and purposes, and has been rightfully panned and attacked for the shameless and obvious ignorance of the current situation that it is. The ongoing genocide that we are witnessing fresh in our minds, and Labour's acquiescence and apparent subservience to the Israeli state, led as it is by that Zionist without qualification Keir Starmer, has not been missed. Here's what Labour's appallingly tone-deaf message was. Today we remember the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, all the victims of Nazi persecution and the victims of more recent genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia and Darfur. Let us learn the lessons from the past and work towards a better future. Short, but anything but sweet. There's something very obvious missing from it. Here's the thing with genocide. You can't just pick and choose the ones you want to remember and then ignore the rest, because it makes you look like a big fat flaming hypocrite, and that fact has not gone unnoticed. It is okay to remember the Holocaust and all say never again in relation to that. And of course any right-thinking human being would not at all disagree with that notion. It is apparently okay for the genocides of Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia and Darfur and associate them with the Holocaust. But it is anything but okay to say one day after a case for genocide has been established against Israel, prima facie, at this stage it might be, but when 30,000 Gazans are dead, including more than 12,000 children, to omit that, pretend that it's not genocide and have the crass boldness to refer to the aforementioned atrocities as the more recent genocides, without bothering with the one that is literally happening right now before our eyes, that has been going on for the last 3 months, is rancid. In fact, worse than that, it is apparently a disciplinary offence to draw that comparison now in Labour, with the situation in Gaza having to be referred to apparently as a humanitarian disaster and not a genocide. An earthquake or a tsunami didn't call all of these deaths. That's a humanitarian disaster. This has been a wanton, indiscriminate bombing and killing of civilians, destruction of infrastructure and services by an occupying power. Labour MP Kate Ossemore made the mistake of making the comparison. She said yesterday, "Tomorrow is Holocaust Memorial Day, an international day to remember the 6 million Jews murdered during the Holocaust, the millions of people murdered under Nazi persecution of other groups, and more recent genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and now Gaza." The ICJ ruling, in my view, now makes that entirely appropriate. I particularly like that she drew attention to other persecuted groups and not just fixated upon Jewish people, because far more than just the Jewish people were persecuted by the Nazis, such as the disabled or the Roma Gypsies. But Labour continued to make excuses for Israel, and so a public apology on social media was evidently demanded of Ossemore. And she later tweeted out, "Holocaust Memorial Day is a day to remember the 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust and the genocides that have occurred since. I apologise for any offence caused by my reference to the ongoing humanitarian disaster in Gaza as part of that period of remembrance." Never apologise for having the courage of your conviction. It's a pity she chose to respond like this rather than lose the whip, though, but this is the heavy-handed treatment that we're seeing being handed out to Labour MPs stepping out of line under the Starmer regime on this matter of Israel and Gaza. What can we, the general public, expect if Starmer becomes Prime Minister on this, I wonder? This isn't just a politician, an MP turning a blind eye to genocide. This is worse. This is a party leader demanding his MPs turn a blind eye, all in the immediate aftermath of the verdict of that ICJ hearing. Starmer himself, of course, is still to pass comment on the ICJ judgment. I can't imagine why a former human rights lawyer might be so shy on this matter. Might it be because if the ICJ eventually do find Israel has committed genocide, according to evidence, and not merely prima facie as they currently do, that might put ignorant Starmer in the position of someone who would have supported that? Whoops! After all, he did say Israel had the right to cut off power and water to Gaza. He's never apologised for it. It's on film for all to see. And to hail the ICJ ruling and provisional orders handed down, that would mean admitting that he was wrong, and he never does that. And it would also mean that Israel must be held to account. There's no statute of limitations on genocide or aiding and abetting in it. He's got that following him for the rest of his life. But he can't do that. Too many in Labour cannot do that. They can't apologise. They can't hold Israel accountable because they owe too much to the Israel lobby to be able to. Here's a fun fact, for example, on all of this. Labour Friends of Israel. 73 Labour MPs counted themselves as members of Labour Friends of Israel before that ICJ judgment was ruled out. Afterwards, there are still 73 of them. Should we now consider them Labour Friends of Genocide instead? 2 weeks ago, Margaret Hodge, Ruth Smeeth, Louise Ellman and Christian Wakeford, again in Israel, happily posed for a snap with Israeli President Isaac Herzog. This guy had signed missiles to be dropped on Gaza, was quoted by the ICJ themselves for having spoken with genocidal intent, and whilst in Davos in Switzerland has found himself the subject of criminal complaints as well. Meanwhile, while Starmer remains tight-lipped, desperately waiting for presumably someone to tell him how to get out of this mess, the UK Foreign Office has continued to defend Israel, saying South Africa's case against Israel was wrong and provocative because, of course, this Tory shambles must know better than the 15 judges at the ICJ who believe genocide has been proven at first glance. Who'd be stupid enough to believe the Tories over them? There, don't answer that. Any opposition worth its salt would be able to put itself on the right side of history, though, show leadership and give the Tories an absolute political pasting for taking such a rancid, offensive stance. But sadly, Keir Starmer is utterly incapable of that, being more ardently pro-Israel than they are, to the point his own MPs are barred from voicing their own opinions on this. Thatcher supported apartheid South Africa, of course, so perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that her heirs in both the Tory party and the Labour Party are with Israel even now, even on Holocaust Memorial Day. If you're going to make exceptions for some genocides, then you aren't against genocide. That sums up the leadership of both main parties here. Never again are just words when never again is happening now, and they're standing by in silence, letting it happen. And today of all days it continues. Both Sunak and Starmer revolt me by their silence, because silence is complicity. If you have a platform and you aren't using it to speak out on this issue, then shame on you. But that applies most of all to those who would lead us, because I don't plan on following you anywhere if you can't take a stand on something like this and be on the right side of history and humanity, frankly. Money and influence have bought your silence, haven't they? But it won't win you my vote. Perhaps they should be directed to this video here where I went over the verdict, went over the fact that although the word ceasefire never came out, that is in practice what the ICJ have actually demanded. And if you haven't seen my take on this verdict, well, why have you not? You can find it here. I reckon you should watch it here next. I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so I am so angry about this story, but I'm also not surprised by it, or how it has come about, as the United Nations itself is now coming under attack by Israel in effect, given that a branch of the UN, in the form of the ICJ, having just slapped down the equivalent of a ceasefire to all intents and purposes on Israel, but instead of stopping what they're doing, they've just gone down a more punitive and sinister route, and it is a route that will directly hit Palestinian civilians the most, those Israel claims, via their Prime Minister Netanyahu at any rate, not to have an issue with. This story broke late yesterday here in the UK. Even the mainstream media are covering it to one extent or another, And that's not too surprising, perhaps, since we here in the UK are one of the guilty parties roped into this now, being played like a fiddle, it seems. But the UNRWA, or UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Agency for Palestinian Refugees, an agency that has existed since 1949 in the aftermath of the Nakba, has now come under attack and sanctioned by 7 countries who financially support it, and support it through humanitarian aid, because it is alleged that of the 15,000 UNRWA workers that are operating within Palestine, 12 have been accused of being Hamas operatives involved with the events of October 7th. And who are the accusers? Well, Israel itself, of course. It's not like they lie at all, though, is it? It totally smacks of revenge by Israel following that ICJ ruling. The timing of this accusation, nearly 4 months on, is incredibly suspicious. But it is the consequences of these actions, this withdrawal of aid, that nobody is considering. Western nations, notably our leaders here in the UK, who haven't thought this through, have obviously not thought this through. And one of those consequences is going to be a painful realisation for Rishi Sunak personally, at that, in the run-up to the general election this year. Right, so if Israel right now said it was raining, I'd want to check the window, because so many of their accusations, from Hamas command centres and hospitals to refugee camps being hit with the wrong size missile, not that any missile should be targeting a refugee camp, to Hebrew laptops being found supposedly the property of Arabic-speaking Hamas, to all of the rhetoric of there being no innocence in Gaza at all of which have led to that recent International Court of Justice ruling, this latest stunt, as I'm calling it, because it needs investigating independently, because the word of the Israeli Defense Force and the Shin Bet police force are frankly worthless right now, in my opinion, and no right-thinking person, let alone government, should be taking their word for anything, especially now prima facie has been met in regards to charges of genocide against this nation state. But sadly, some Western nations just seem to be so slavishly loyal to Israel, for whatever reason, influence, money, whatever, that they jump at the first sniff of someone acting against them, even now, and are more than happy to take them at their word. This is actually, I think, really sinister, this attack now on the UN aid agency operating within Gaza. It's like conventional warfare, and blowing Gazan civilians up as they have been is no longer permissible thanks to the ICJ ruling. So here's a story about some of the aid workers working in Gaza being linked to Hamas. We'll scream blue murder about that, and our friends in the West will cut off aid. Innocent Gazans still die, but Israel isn't responsible directly. Firstly, UNRWA acted to part ways with these 12 individuals and launched an investigation. That is fine. I would have thought that suspension would have been better. However, I'm not out there. I don't know if a westernised suspension policy would pass muster in Palestine, so I'm not going to argue this particular point. However, if Israel said all UNRWA workers in Gaza were Hamas, would they do the same thing? Whilst UNRWA argue they do this to protect the integrity of their organisation, it in effect hasn't worked, as Western nations line up to withdraw funding from that organisation, seemingly in their unwavering support for Israel, which includes evidently the withdrawal of aid from Gaza, which will see people already 93% of whom are not eating more than once a day, with famine already identified as a real possibility and threat, now a virtual certainty. Let's put this in perspective a minute. There are 15,000 UNRWA workers in Gaza. There are some 30,000 people who work for UNRWA all told. 12 of them have had accusations levelled against them, and those accusations have come from the oh-so-honest and virtuous IDF and Shin Bet. And that's enough to cut off aid to the entire UN agency for 7 Western countries, is it? What a sick and twisted world we live in. It is impossible for leaders even as stupid as ours to not realise the ramifications of cutting off financial and humanitarian aid on this scale, now of all times, in Gaza. Israel have completely succeeded in carrying on killing Gazan civilians as they have, but this time without a single shot being fired, because that is the inevitable consequence of this, or at least one such consequence. There are other consequences our stupid leaders likely haven't considered. Look at who these leaders are, by the way. Rishi Sunak, Genocide Joe, no surprises there. Justin Trudeau of Canada, another populist. Geert Wilders, the hard-right fool with the stupid hair in the Netherlands. Giorgia Meloni, equally hard-right leader of Italy, plus the leaders of Finland and Australia. All right-wing to varying degrees, funnily enough. So consequences. First, there's the consequences associated with how over-the-top this action is. We're talking 12 people amongst 15,000, and you defund the entire organisation. You're talking about 0.08% of all those working in Gaza for UNRWA. People will starve as a direct result of this. We know that famine is already a significant threat, and more of a threat that becomes the longer this pause, as it's being called, on funding goes on. But what are the conditions that you would lift this pause then? Israel giving you the thumbs up? UNRWA investigation concluding, maybe? You'd take their word for it, would you, given they are the accused? Well, you're all stupid enough to believe what Israel would tell you. I bet this wouldn't be good enough for you, though, until it's good enough for Israel, though. All 7 of these nations have jumped the gun without thinking things through. It's all happened too fast. And when other nations are holding fire pending the results of the UNRWA investigation as to whether they would withdraw funding, that would have been the common sense view, of course. But how long can UNRWA survive without funding, though? That's a really big question, and it's one I'm going to have to park for a minute, because we're in how long is a piece of string territory there at this moment in time. Not a very long piece of string, though, I'm sure. Of course, the obvious consequence is how long can people survive? Barely surviving now. Already we've had instances where people have starved to death in Gaza. That will certainly increase. More will die. And that is on Western hands now as much as Israel's, which brings me to the next consequence of aiding and abetting. Israel is already now in court charged with genocide, the conditions of prima facie having now been met. They have been told to ensure humanitarian aid and infrastructure is restored, but they can now point to UNRWA being compromised by Hamas as to a reason that hasn't been possible. They can point to other countries defunding them as a reason that hasn't been possible. What useful patsies these 7 nations are. What useful idiots to be effectively committing collective punishment on Israel's behalf. Israel can now point to the UK or the US or Italy and say, well, it's their fault, don't blame us. We've taken the word of a nation accused of genocide, that their attackers have infiltrated the UN aid agency out there to the tune of 12 people and decided that that is ground to suspend all support to the entire organisation. The word idiot just isn't big enough. But if Rishi Sunak needs a big red warning light / klaxon as to how stupid he's been, then this next one really ought to do it, because this one could come back to bite him right in his 5 pledges to the nation ahead of the general election. As we know, there's almost certainly going to be a general election this year at some point, and Sunak made these 5 pledges, didn't he? Which he's failing on badly for the most part, which also isn't news to many people. Now, as we've been observing, there are those within the Israeli government who want the entire 2.2 million population of Gaza removed, and they take the land. A notable example would be the Israeli Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir. But where do all these people go? And indeed, many have already left Gaza via the Rafah border crossing, of course. We've seen them doing that. Possibly to stay in Egypt, or possibly to go elsewhere and seek asylum. Do you see where I'm going yet? Well, the UK doesn't accept asylum seekers from Palestine, you might be surprised to know. And the reason for that is that they have UNRWA working out there instead to assist these people. But by defunding that organisation, potentially collapsing it under the Human Rights Act, Palestinians would, in theory, all of a sudden be entitled to claim asylum here. It seems crazy to assume at least some people from the region wouldn't attempt to claim asylum here. It isn't just Gaza either. People in the West Bank would be able to as well. The argument that they wouldn't be entitled to asylum here because UNRWA looks after them would fall flat under legal testing, I'm sure. And I'm also sure there will be human rights lawyers more than happy to take such a case on and test that. Sunak's pledge to stop the boats could well increase them instead, because he stopped aid over 12 people on allegations made by a nation that lies with impunity in regards to its own conduct in Gaza, which it holds under occupation, to the point it stands accused of genocide in the World Court now. I didn't think we could have a Prime Minister more stupid than Liz Truss, but Sunak might just have proven it. As much as the media fixate on 12 potential Hamas operatives within UNRWA, though, well, they should focus on more of the 152 UNRWA workers who have died just doing their jobs in Gaza. UNRWA doesn't just provide aid. It runs 22 health facilities catering to 3.4 million visits a year and runs 183 schools. Over 250,000 students, fully 1/8 of the entire population of the Gaza Strip, go to its schools. They run women's centres. They run all manner of facilities. All of that now faces collapse. Netanyahu and his cabinet will be clapping their hands with glee at this, because They can't be blamed for everyday life collapsing in Gaza as a result of the fall of UNRWA, should it come to that, thanks to their handy 7 Western nations helping them out and scapegoating them. I've got no more words to describe the stupidity of Western leaders' actions leading up to this. But words are exactly what Israel have had plenty of in response to that ICJ prima facie ruling and the provisional orders handed down in their South Africa case, though. Haig Schmeig, it's been described as. There's obeying international law for you, isn't it? You can find out what some more of Netanyahu's loyalists, not just he himself, have been saying about the outcome of this initial court case, this initial hearing. Put that in perspective of what their Western allies are now doing, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Keir Starmer's Labour. Starmer, personally in all probability, given what has happened, have a significant racism problem that is being largely ignored after it was weaponised to send Jeremy Corbyn packing, and nothing quite shows how blatant that is than the suspension of yet another black female Labour MP. Kate Osmore is the latest in a line of ethnic minority Labour MPs to end up on the receiving end of Starmeroid diktat following her Holocaust Memorial Day message. She dared to name Gaza amongst the genocides aside from the Holocaust that also get remembered on that day. Following the International Court of Justice ruling that there is a case of genocide to be heard against Israel, that the terms of prima facie were met, that at first glance there appears to be evidence of genocide committed by Israel in Gaza against the Gazan people, Osmore was completely correct to include Gaza, a genocide happening right now, that all leaders around the world would have a responsibility, if their nations are signed up to the Genocide Convention as ours is, to oppose that. Instead, the Labour Party of Keir Starmer has been completely Israeled. Osmore was pulled up for what she did and was made to apologise, which she did, meeting the requirements expected of her apparently by the party whips, only to find herself still suspended from the Labour Party following that anyway. This is not the first time Starmer and his ilk have opportunistically weaponised the party rules to attack the left member of his own parliamentary party. Not the first time that this has been directed at an ethnic minority member of his party either. And not the first time Israel has been at the centre of such action at that, with such presence as that state appears to have within the Labour Party. But by punishing an MP for basically echoing the opinion of the highest court in the world, Starmer and co are effectively banning free thought. You do and say what you're told, or else. Right, so doing and saying what you're told. Well, we know that's how Keir Starmer likes to lead. Someone holds his hand and tells him what to say and do and what to think. And if in doubt, well, just copy Rishi Sunak. The question has always been one of who exactly is it telling him what to do. Peter Mandelson and Tony Blair always spring to mind. If that doesn't show a blind spot to war crimes, I'm not sure what does. But he runs his party like a version of theirs, just even more hardline on the disciplinary front. But it always seems to be rotten lefties that get punished, making it factional, but also, too often, blatantly racist. Let's start with Kate Osmore, because this is what has got people incensed that Starmer's purging of unwanted socialist and left-wing elements of his party is happening under the guise of pretty much anything that can be weaponised against them. As I covered in another video, Kate Osmore, the day before Holocaust Memorial Day, which was this past Saturday, put out a message of memorial saying, "Tomorrow is Holocaust Memorial Day, an international day to remember the 6 million Jews murdered during the Holocaust, the millions of people murdered under Nazi persecution of other groups, and more recent genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and now Gaza." Now, the ICJ ruling, in my view, now makes this an entirely appropriate thing to say. They have found that the legal definition of genocide in relation to Israel's actions in Gaza has been met at prima facie. They are the highest court in the world. Anyone who thinks they know better than them really needs to have some balls. And balls really aren't something I'd associate with Keir Starmer. Not with that voice, and certainly not with his conduct and what passes for leadership in Labour today. Picking on MPs, however, is something to associate with the Starmer regime, bullying and intimidation, and as such an apology and correction was evidently demanded of Osmore, as she later tweeted out, "Holocaust Memorial Day is a day to remember the 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust and the genocides that have occurred since. I apologise for any offence caused by my reference to the ongoing humanitarian disaster in Gaza as part of that period of remembrance." That, we are told, was the requirement by the party whips to put an end to this matter. It doesn't matter that this is what Osmore did, though. It wasn't enough for somebody. or something. Possibly Starmer himself. We know, after all, that he personally abused his own executive powers to keep Jeremy Corbyn suspended when accused of anti-Semitism and cleared by the Labour NEC. But equally, the influence of Israel is so pervasive that this simply may not have been enough for such elements in relation to that. Look at the determination of a Knesset member at this moment in time, Danny Danon, right now to see a Sky News host, Bel Donati, sacked for daring to hold him to account for comments he'd made in relation to ethnic cleansing. When somebody gets one up on them, they simply cannot just let it go. And equally, when someone chooses to say something they don't like, even when it has basis in law right now, at prima facie level anyway, the accusation of genocide, they can't have that either. Labour, equally, shamelessly have aped Rishi Sunak and the Tories in continuing to support Israel, right down to backing their reprehensible and human rights violating, in my view, decision to withdraw aid from UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees. This is collective punishment. This is Labour going along with the Tories in committing a war crime. It's also quite telling that Labour have gone along with this on the basis of Israel-made accusations, which may have about as much truth to them as Starmer's 10 leadership pledges did. Against just 12 UNRWA workers, yet they've made nothing, no acknowledgement, nothing about the 152 UNRWA workers who have died in Gaza, literally doing their job, helping Palestinians. Starmer's Labour is one of utter moral cowardice. So, anyway, we know that Labour is full of such people. Starmer himself recruited a member of the IDF to spy on members' social media, even whilst he was laying off staff elsewhere because he'd blown the money that he'd been left as he became leader, settling legal fees of cases the party was involved in, notably one against Panorama whistleblowers, and we all know now what they were blowing hot air about. Legal advice was the party would win, but that wasn't the point. Starmer is a Zionist without qualification, and his actions very much appear to mean that is one thing about him we can definitely trust. He owes being leader of the party in no small part to donations from people linked to the Israel lobby. 73 of his MPs count themselves amongst Labour Friends of Israel, a group which Starmer frankly should have proscribed because of the charges and provisional orders laid down by the World Court against Israel. But of course he won't. He's one of them. His NEC counts a literal paid Israel lobbyist amongst its number, the director of We Believe in Israel, Luke Akehurst, who would dismiss him from being behind this incident with Keir Starmer. So the influence of Israel and Labour is well known, well established, but the treatment of Ossemore here is also massively hypocritical. Back in July 2020, Labour MP Steve Reed made a very ill-advised and crass comment attacking Richard Desmond, a Tory donor and former proprietor of the comic pretending to be a newspaper that we call the Daily Express, in relation to that housing scandal that honest Bob Robert Jenrick was involved in. Do you remember that one? It wasn't so long ago. It's a little bit hard to forget. There was a big hoo-ha about that, wasn't there? Well, it was Desmond that Jenrick was trying to get off some of the fees. He was the guy whose housing development was involved, and even though he's a billionaire and Desmond could well afford it, Jenrick was trying to save him some money. Well, Reed referred to Desmond as a puppet master for the entire Tory cabinet, thinking himself, oh, so witty and clever, but negating to realise that Desmond was also Jewish, and by calling him a puppet master, he'd invoked a well-known anti-Semitic trope. Reed apologised, of course, and that was that, because he's not a lefty, he's not black, and he's quite male. He literally said something racist, and nothing happened. No suspension, no censure, no nothing. He apologised for it, and that was that. But then Kate Ossemore was told exactly the same thing, and what she said is based entirely on the verdict of the International Court of Justice. So it isn't racist if it's true. Double standards, staggering, but then there are so many more examples of free thought and free speech, especially against ethnic minority members of the Labour Party, that we can point at. Nadia Whitten was sacked as a PPC for voting against UK troops being made exempt from prosecution for war crimes and torture. Kim Johnson at PMQs last year asked this of Rishi Sunak. Since the election of the fascist Israeli government in December last year, there has been an increase in human rights violations against Palestinian civilians, including children. So can the Prime Minister tell us how he is challenging what Amnesty and other human rights organisations are referring to as an apartheid state? A fair enough question, especially in light of what we know at this moment in time now, and the strength of wording entirely appropriate given the language we hear coming from some of Netanyahu's ministers. But again, an apology was forced out of her for asking that question, because she later returned to the Commons to say, I would like to apologise unreservedly for the intemperate language I used during PMQs. I was wrong to use the term fascist in relation to the Israeli government, and understand why this was particularly insensitive given the history of the State of Israel. And while there are far-right elements in the government, I recognise the use of the term was wrong. I would also like to apologise for the use of the term apartheid state. While I was quoting accurately Amnesty's description, I recognise this is insensitive and would like to withdraw it. Says everything about the Labour Party of Keir Starmer today, though, doesn't it? Afsana Begum is another Labour MP, another rotten lefty, ethnic minority Labour MP, who's been on the receiving end of Starmer's ire. Who faced domestic violence. She's a domestic violence survivor. She got no support from the Labour Party throughout any of that. They hoped that her being dragged to court on trumped-up charges of housing benefit fraud would enable them to expel her. But she got cleared, much to their annoyance. The lack of support she had throughout all of that, though, ended up hospitalising her at one point. Diane Abbott sent out the wrong copy of a newspaper comment coming on for a year ago now, and was suspended over that, despite also issuing a swift retraction, clarification, and apology. It is opportunistic attacks, not just on the left, but in so many cases against people of ethnic minority background, and it's not going unnoticed around the country, with the sheer number of councillors and constituency party officers and other Labour Party members resigning from the party in disgust, pointing at racism as one of the reasons behind that. Notably, this has come in recent times from the Muslim and Jewish members in light of the pro-Israel stance of the party leadership. Nothing will shake the unwavering support of Keir Starmer's Labour for Israel, not even, it seems, charges of genocide. And you want to put these people in power to get the Tories out? Are you mad? Of course, there's been praise for Labour's treatment of Ossemore from the usual suspects. The Board of Deputies of British Jews, very much pro-Israel and very much not representative of all British Jewry, tweeted out, "We commend the Labour Party for suspending the whip from Ms Ossemore following her disgraceful comments regarding Holocaust Memorial Day. This is the right decision, sending a clear message that such behaviour is unacceptable. We trust that the investigation will proceed swiftly." You can trust that it won't. The investigation I want to proceed swiftly is the one happening in The Hague, though. Diane Abbott has been waiting for over a year, so swift is not the name of the game here. The clock's ticking, and the general election is coming, and they're hoping time's going to run out on these people. The Jewish Labour movement, where you need neither be Jewish nor in Labour to be a part of, but are the go-to authority within Labour on all things anti-Semitic, so you can guess where their opinion on Israel takes them as well, therefore, put out a statement too, saying, "This week we've been commemorating the murder of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust and those who perished in subsequent genocides. Sadly, Kate Ossemore MP used Holocaust Memorial Day to make an inappropriate and offensive comparison to the war in Gaza. Her subsequent non-apology rang hollow. These days we know the Labour Party is better than this. We join others, including our own CLP, in calling for Labour to suspend her whilst they investigate." Well, they did suspend her, and her comparison is entirely valid given the ICJ verdict the other day, and how can it be a non-apology when her apology literally included the words, "I apologise"? Nothing will satisfy these rancid organisations and individuals. Labour is full of people like this, led by the same. I could not despise a political party in this country more right now for being so depraved on something so serious. It is a party of anti-black racism, Islamophobia and collective punishment of Palestinians. I can go further, but don't take my word for it. Take the words of others. Read the Labour Leaks report. Read the Ford report. Starmer refuses to. He's even banned his MPs from speaking to Martin Ford, the KC who authored it, also himself black, and who himself has said anti-black racism and Islamophobia is not taken as seriously as anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. By definition, that makes the party racist. If one form of racism is more important than another, and if you want an idea of how entrenched in the Labour Party Israeli state actors are, go on YouTube and watch Al Jazeera's The Lobby. And if you'd forgotten about that, watch it again. Because things haven't changed, even if some of the faces have. And if you want yet one more example of this, you should watch this video here concerning another decent black Labour MP, Dawn Butler, who literally wrote a book on what she has faced within the Labour Party as a black woman. Don't take my word for it. Take hers and watch this video next, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Israel, if it wasn't clear before, have no intention whatsoever of paying any attention to the accusations of genocide now levelled against them. or the provisional orders made against them by the International Court of Justice. As the worst of Benjamin Netanyahu's hard-right government, 12 of his ministers, in fact, including members of his own Likud party, danced and sang in attendance of a conference, the entire purpose of which was to consider how to legally force the resettlement of the entire Gazan population elsewhere, so that Israel may assimilate the Gaza Strip, take it over entirely and settle it for themselves. They danced and sang in celebration of annexation and settlement, a war crime, and they did it for the whole world to see, knowing that even now, even with them doing this, so many world leaders will shield them and protect them and covet them, instead of upholding international law. Right, so if anything about this entire Israeli genocide of Gaza gets under my skin right now, it's the brazen arrogance of those in charge in Israel in the face of genocide accusations being demonstrated against them, and them still carrying on regardless, as if the international treaties and conventions and legislation they've signed up to don't actually apply to them. If international law isn't upheld and respected by all signatories, then it is worthless. And those Western countries guilty of this, including us here in the UK, both by the governing party and the party likely to take over following the next general election, shows that is unlikely to change. Global rule of law and democracy is under threat as the West decides Israel is an exception, when there can be no exceptions. But when they can openly hold a conference discussing ethnic cleansing in front of cameras and do so brazenly that they fear no repercussions at all, then you know we're in trouble. And other nations considering charges against other nations for aiding and abetting Israel, well, the UK deserves its day in the dock on that score as much as anyone else. So what is this conference all about then, Damo? Well, a dozen members of Netanyahu's government attended a far-right conference. It's the equivalent of Sunak and Starmer joining Tommy Robinson on a hate march, basically, called Settlement Brings Security and Victory, and was organised by the far-right Nahala organisation. Nahala is a pro-settler organisation advocating for more settlement in Judea and Samaria, as they call it, the West Bank as we know it today, but also the Gaza Strip too. Now, two of Netanyahu's infamously awful ministers, individuals that he is in coalition with, his finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich of the Religious Zionist Party, and his security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir of hard-right Otzma Yehudit, were in attendance amongst others. Smotrich made claims that the children that had been evacuated had returned as soldiers to fight for Hamas, another indication that they still claim, even the kids of Gaza, half the population of Gaza, incidentally, is under 18. You don't survive adulthood there being the obvious conclusion to draw from that statement. But even the kids are guilty. He went on that only settlement brings security. Ben-Gvir made the claim that there will be another October 7th if we do not control the territory. When the deaths that occurred on October 7th and how many can actually be attributed to Hamas is something that is hotly contested given the use of Hannibal directives, which is an accusation being levelled at Israel, an accusation made by many eyewitnesses, and for which Israel's going to have a day in court at The Hague in relation to at some point in the future now, that the ICJ has decided there is a case to hear for genocide. The Minister for Communications, Shlomo Karhi, was in attendance as well. This guy's a member of Netanyahu's own Likud party, and he said that the population of Gaza needed to be forced into wanting to leave. Those accusations against 12 members of UNRWA, the UN aid agency working in Gaza, 12 out of 15,000, I might add, which has saw several nations defund the entire organisation over and herald mass starvation of famine in the region as this move will result in, completely unfounded, since the only proof of that at this point is the word of the occupiers and the word of the people talking about ethnic cleansing at this conference. Nahala spokesperson and settler advocate Daniela Weiss said that the Arabs will not stay in Gaza, and that starvation may be needed in order to convince those who may feel otherwise. Starvation as a weapon. Starvation is exactly what is being engineered by the defunding of UNRWA, thanks to the complicit idiocy of leaders in Western countries. And this is again a war crime. Literally everything Israel wants is being facilitated. So how on earth many of these supportive nations and their leaders won't face war crime charges themselves down the line, I have no idea. How can they not see the wood for the trees? It's beyond me. They face a day of reckoning themselves. Still they won't call Israel out. Do they figure that the lack of any ability to enforce these rulings from the ICJ by the ICJ itself is going to save them? Do they feel that the toothlessness of the UN and the fact the Security Council can be vetoed from doing anything to enforce them will save them? Well, more and more focus will end up on the UN General Assembly and the Uniting for Peace legislation, in which case won't it? And should genocide be proven in the case of Israel on Gaza in time? Well, you'll be on the wrong side of history then, won't you? And as far as we here in the UK are concerned, with both main parties and both party leaders equally complicit, even if there is a change of government, those in power can't get away with just sending those who are no longer in power to The Hague, because that will be complete hypocrisy. And if the PM at the time happens to be Keir Starmer, a former human rights lawyer, what a joke we're going to look at on the international legal stage. Indeed, this very conference might end up being used as evidence, it seems. An actual human rights lawyer, insofar as he actually seems to believe in human rights, unlike Starmer, whose Zionism appears to supersede that, is one chap who's a special advisor to the Norwegian Refugee Council, a chap called Itai Epstein. He took to Twitter and he shared footage of Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir stood arm over shoulder dancing at the conference, and said the image would form part of compelling evidence of non-compliance with the provisional orders handed down by the ICJ. Because this conference was held just 2 days after the ICJ's provisional orders ruling. So within 2 days of being told there was a case and those 6 provisional orders from the ICJ were handed down, a dozen members of the Israeli government were in attendance, singing and dancing and giving speeches at this ethnic cleansing conference. They were even sharing maps there of where all the old Gazan towns and villages were, and where the Israeli settlements that were torn down in 2005 when Israel pulled out of Gaza, only to put it under blockade 2 years later, would be re-established, along with 6 entirely new settlements. Gaza is being pounded to rubble north to south with nothing spared. You can't help but see this as wiping the slate clean for new settlements to be established. All the signs are there, both in deeds and in words. All that happened within the first hour of the conference, according to Epstein. Now, Netanyahu may continue to deny settlement is his intention, but it very much is the intention, it seems, of coalition partners he relies on to keep him in power. So who has the real power here? And who has the real intent and plan to carry that intent out? Even Israeli newspaper Haaretz has condemned what went on. One of their writers, Nir Hasson, took to Twitter saying, 2 additional insights from the evening in the nation's buildings. 1, this is not really a conference on settlement, it is a conference on transfer. This was said in endless ways by ministers, members of the Knesset and rabbis. Ben-Gvir spoke of encouraging voluntary immigration. Karai overtook him on the right and explained that desire during war is sometimes a situation that forces one to say, I want. Daniela Weiss wondered how it could be that millions of war refugees move from country to country all over the world, and only these monsters must be connected to their land. Attorney Aviad Basoli explained in a pamphlet distributed by the organisers that Nakba 2 is legal. Rabbi Uzi Sharbath added that one should behave like Joshua ben Nun, the extermination and deportation of anyone who opposes the rule of the people of Israel in the land of Israel, and much more, for the attention of The Hague. And 2, it was an unusually happy conference in the Israeli public since October 7th. Thousands danced and sang with truly ecstatic enthusiasm. Ben-Gvir was received like a rock star. Smotrich spoke about the natural health that exists here with strength, joy and devotion. At least someone is happy here. Yeah, even rabbis were there, but if you're familiar with the UK's chief rabbi, Ephraim Mervis, that might not surprise you. Israel are telling the world what they intend to do, and still Western nations will wring their hands and claim this proves nothing. It proves everything. And if Sunak and Starmer are going to continue to back genocide in their actions and their pathetic excuses and drag all of us, this entire country, into being complicit in that, then don't for the love of God vote for either of them to be put in power. We have it in our power, in our votes, to stop the UK being a complicit partner here. But only if we vote for change, both for Palestine and ourselves. And if you still think the events of October 7th justify all of this that has followed, then I might encourage you gently to think about whose accounts of those events you've been listening to, because I'll bet you've not heard Hamas's version of events. After the number of times Israeli accounts of events have been debunked as lies, surely that would be a reasonable thing to do, wouldn't it? Well, fortunately I've covered this statement, so I reckon you should perhaps watch this video next, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so if I was the frothy-mouthed, migrant-bashing, Nigel Farage pointing at small boats from a cliff-top type, possibly with a complexion comparable to a clove-studded joint of meat adorning the Christmas table, the prospect of even more migrants attempting to reach our shores would have me screaming into my morning copy of the Daily Mail. So often, the people trying to reach our shores are people we ourselves have had a hand in displacing. And there's no more obvious example of that right now than our activities in Israel, given the genocide they're conducting in Gaza that our UK government appears to very much be aiding and abetting in. We are creating a whole new swathe of potential small boat migrants. If you don't believe me, listen to the words of this settler, because it is literally Israel's intent. Right, so what's this all about then, Damo? Well, as regular viewers will know, yesterday I put out a video covering Israeli ministers attending a pro-settler event, which was basically a vehicle to discuss the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. This was organised by the pro-settler organisation Nahala, and one of their key spokespeople is settler activist Daniela Weiss, who happened to take to camera, such is their brazenness, and tell the whole world effectively exactly what their intentions are. Listen to this short clip.
There will be no Arabs in the Gaza Strip. They will go to Turkey, to Scotland, to Britain. I don't want to kill them. I want them out of Gaza, and we'll use different methods. One of them is not to give them any humanitarian aid, so the countries of the world will have pity on them and take them.
I don't want to kill them, I just want them out of Gaza, and one of the ways to do that is to not give them humanitarian aid, she said. Genocide grandma there. You withhold aid, people will die. You can not wish them dead all you like, but death is what such actions would lead to. And the thing is, though, she's right. If Israel do take over Gaza and there's little sign on the international stage that anyone is prepared to stop them, preferring to aid and abet them instead, where will all the people end up? The people of Gaza are being forced out via the southern gate at Rafah into the Sinai desert of Egypt, but they won't stay there. This move has been somewhat obvious for weeks, ever since the ceasefire, because Israeli troops prevented anyone from the north of Gaza returning north during that time, shooting people who tried, sent them all south to start with, where they told them it would be safe for them, and have instead began targeting them there too. Safety being a relative term, only coming once through the Rafah border crossing, and even then, they've got nothing. Egypt's problem then? Well, let's consider that for a moment. Say that Israel succeeds in seizing Gaza and casting out every Palestinian there, 2.2 million people. Do you really think Egypt will assimilate them all, take them all on? That'd be silly. Who would want to do that? That's a vast amount of people. No one nation would take them on. Besides, would all Palestinians want to even stay there? Better prospects in the West, aren't there? Those same Western nations helping Israel destabilise the region now could end up with these same people turning up on their doorsteps. Daniela Weiss named Scotland and Britain specifically. Right now we don't have to take any Palestinian refugees because UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees, looks after them and we fund them. Or did, until Israel decided to make accusations against 12 of their 15,000 workers in Gaza, accusing them of helping Hamas on the night of October 7th. The word of these consummate liars, I have no issue saying that given how many of their previous accusations have been debunked. Their word is good enough for our stupid leaders here in the UK, Sunak and Starmer both. As a result, Sunak has stopped all humanitarian aid and funding that this country provides to UNRWA. And Starmer has, as usual, supported him in that. They aren't the only countries to have done that, of course. Plenty of other idiotic leaders of other countries have done likewise. The US, Canada, Australia, Italy and more. But collectively, all that contributes to is the potential collapse of the aid agency itself, and certainly hinders them in the immediate term, their ability to provide aid to those in dire need of it, as the population of Gaza teeters on starvation. This is, of course, one of the weapons Daniela Weiss proposed, though, the denial of humanitarian aid. She's also softened up countries that previously didn't have to or weren't required to accept Palestinian refugees into accepting them. Where exactly is the win in supporting Israel here? They must view some Western leaders as a bunch of useful idiots, and they wouldn't be wrong. They help collapse the aid and leave themselves in a position to have to take these people off their hands as a result. 2 for the price of 1. We've seen this picture before. Afghanistan, Syria. You destabilise a region, you create refugees, they turn up to seek asylum elsewhere. a better life to start over somewhere safe, and Britain is very much seen as that. Rishi Sunak is failing to stop the boats as things stand now. The boat crossings across the Channel, they've begun again this month after weeks of poor weather stopping any crossings. That didn't stop James stupidly from bragging about no boat crossings during that period, of course, but there was a very good weather-related reason for that, as was eventually pointed out to it. The people traffickers will be sniffing a red letter day in the near future with the thought of all those desperate people from Gaza potentially trying to come here. 2.2 million of them, potentially. But how many of them will actually make a beeline for Britain? Well, you can't rule out at least some of them. How many, though? Anyone's guess, isn't it? It's not just the boat crossings we've been left incapable of dealing with. No legal safe route for asylum claims to be made here, of course. Having been genocided out of their own land, no possible way of returning them. Every single asylum application would have to be accepted. They would literally have no land to be able to return them to. Israel would never allow them back, potentially threatening to execute them for all we know, should we send them back. Once gone, they will do or say whatever it takes to block their return. So all of these asylum applications, well, they'd have to be accepted, wouldn't they? Having left the EU and preferring to take the piss over their crackpot Rwanda scheme rather than set up a new returns policy with the EU, the Tories have left us wide open to having to house every single person who comes here and successfully seeks asylum. If we still had a returns policy with the EU, we would only take a share of them, a fair share of them, the burden being shared around the rest of Europe, and we wouldn't even need to rejoin the EU to negotiate this. It can still be done. So it is a sick joke. It hasn't been. But such is the lunacy of this Tory government, who would rather not do that because they prefer to be able to attack Europe instead. As for Rwanda, well, it isn't a safe country, and changing the law here to get around that doesn't change that fact. On the international stage, the Rwanda bill currently going through the legislative process, Labour in the Lords shamefully sitting on their hands last night, once again, as the Greens tried to pass a fatal motion killing it off and failing, thanks to Labour Lords and Starmer whipping them to say, well, it's not our job to stop such legislation, when it literally is, and you're paid more than £300 a day in the Lords to actually do that. If you aren't going to do that, get out and make way for somebody who will. But if it passes, it will be taken to court. It will be ruled illegal at that point, I would imagine, under human rights legislation, thus triggering a desire to leave the Human Rights Convention, I expect. To be honest, I think that is the Tory party's end game anyway. But let's entertain the prospect for a moment that they can deport asylum seekers to Rwanda, that they get to that point where they can get those planes going and Suella Braverman's dream comes true. Rwanda have already said there are some people they won't accept, which includes anyone with criminal convictions. Think about that for a moment. Israel lock up Palestinians all the time on trumped-up charges, if any charges. So I honestly wonder how many Palestinians wouldn't have some sort of a criminal record thanks to Israel. They also won't accept families, that might be a new one on you, or anyone under the age of majority, which in Rwanda, like here, is 18. Well, half the population of Gaza are under 18. We wouldn't be able to send, therefore, most Palestinians that might come here to Rwanda, even if the Rwanda deal ends up standing and becoming law. So as things stand, the majority of any Palestinian refugees that apply to come here to seek asylum, as would be their right, if UNRWA collapses as we in part defund them, would have to be homed here. 2.2 million people, potentially. And both idiot leaders are helping things along so that this vision becomes more and more of a reality. And the aspiration of genocide grandma Daniela Weiss and the rest of the Israeli settler movement becomes more of a reality, rather than the insane ramblings of hard-right fringe groups as they should be treated as. The Israeli government, many elements of them, are encouraging and enabling these attitudes. Many, as I said at the start, were in attendance at that ethnic cleansing conference, more details of which you can find here on this video if so inclined to watch it. Definitely my recommendation for you next. More evidence that Israel are heading in this direction despite ongoing denials from Benjamin Netanyahu himself. He's not exactly in the driving seat though. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers folks. Right, so we're almost at the end of January, and you might not have realised this, but Hamas haven't fired a single rocket into Israel at all for the whole of this year, until last night. I hadn't realised this until I picked up on this story this morning. It's not like our media reporting that all the Israeli atrocity committed in Gaza this year has gone without retaliation from Hamas for weeks now, though if you were to ask Israel, they'd tell you it was because they're winning the war. They're taking Hamas out. They're destroying all of their weaponry. And although the resumption of the rocket fire from Gaza into Israel does have the effect of exposing that Israeli narrative as yet another pack of lies coming from them, that isn't the reason they have resumed attacks of their own, because the real reason is so much sadder than that, and is just so bloody avoidable. Right, so last night rocket attacks from Hamas resumed, targeting Tel Aviv with some 10 or 11 rockets. Different sources quote different numbers, but no fatalities were reported. Why in over a month is this the first time Hamas have fired any rockets? Why did they actually stop when Israel clearly haven't let up on their atrocities at all? Well, it comes back to that South African submission against Israel for the crime of genocide against Gaza. Hamas welcomed the intervention by South Africa, and when the application by South Africa was filed on December 29th of last year, Hamas put its rockets down. For the first time ever, Israel was being held to account, and they were going to let due process take its course. Israel was having its day in the dock at The Hague, would face the International Court of Justice and be forced to face up to its crimes. Throughout January, as they waited for the ICJ to set that date for the hearings and then hear those hearings and then deliberated over the evidence presented before arriving at a provisional judgment in order to intervene and lay down orders to mitigate potential genocide. Hamas left their rockets where they were. And indeed, if the ICJ judgment were being adhered to, being listened to, if the international community, if all those signatories of the Genocide Convention around the world were upholding those provisional orders, as they have a responsibility to, were meeting those responsibilities, Hamas probably still wouldn't have fired a single rocket. But that hasn't been the case, has it? The ICJ laid out its provisional orders, and within 2 days, Israeli government ministers were singing and dancing and giving speeches at a conference where plans were drawn up to ethnically cleanse Gaza and put responsibility for the 2.2 million people this would displace on the rest of the world. Benjamin Netanyahu gave a speech saying all decent right-thinking people would ignore the judgment of the ICJ. Our leaders here in the UK have dodged commenting on the ICJ ruling, but couldn't fall over themselves fast enough to back up Israel as they accused UNRWA of being a vehicle for Hamas, on the basis that they have, without evidence, accused 12 members of that organisation, 15,000 strong in Gaza, of helping Hamas on October 7th. The USA is just the same. White House spokesperson John Kirby, a man with a perpetual expression of desperately needing the bathroom, continues to deny and make excuses for what is blatantly happening before all of our eyes. Western nations have lined up to defund UNRWA as a result, the only humanitarian body operating within Gaza, operating medical facilities, schools and more, upholding a large part of the infrastructure, and is the reason so many Western nations, ours included, does not need to take Palestinian applications for asylum. All of that is now up in the air. Another more sinister part of the attack on UNRWA itself, notably, given their involvement in Gaza, is that makes them a key source for evidence for the ICJ trial against Israel. So if they collapse or are brought down, the South African case against Israel becomes increasingly more jeopardised. Israel have as good as admitted this in the past, that unless UNRWA is disbanded, the war against Gaza cannot be won. This is a coordinated political attack on the last line of defence for Gaza should all else fail. Despite the legal ruling, despite prima facie being met on the matter of Israeli genocide in Gaza and the case being taken on formally by the ICJ and being taken forwards, despite the risks of being found to be aiding and abetting genocide by so many other nations and their leaders individually, they have still chosen to take Israel's side, as if they are a better judge of the actual situation than the highest court on the planet is. The reality is more along the lines of, for the sake of having a foothold in the Middle East, the lives of Palestinians are a price worth paying. Well, I won't be supporting any leader or any political party that supports that. Both the Tories and Labour can go to hell. Equally, however, we can point to other nations in the Middle East for their inaction too. Where are the other Arab nations? Where are the oil-rich Gulf nations? Sure, the Houthis in Yemen are doing their bit to blockade shipping, but that doesn't help the people of Gaza. That just causes problems for Israel. Iran is an oil-rich Gulf nation, arguably the most powerful nation in the Middle East. They might be funding the Houthis, but how about they fund UNRWA instead? It can only ever be seen as an inherent weakness that this UN aid agency is so heavily reliant on Western pro-Israel nations for its funding. Iran and others, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, whoever, could step in with funding and keep UNRWA going, removing their financial concerns overnight. They're wealthy enough. These are Muslims like you for the most part, are they not? Arabs like you, are they not? Is this not why you're up in arms at Israel's actions? Well, how about putting some aid money where your mouths are? Israel think they can stop UNRWA by undermining their reputation and finances. You guys out there are wealthy enough and powerful enough to screw that idea right up. Compared to those vast oil revenues some of these nations make, to keep UNRWA going would be a drop in the ocean, if you forgive the pun. So in light of legal enforcement failures, aid agency smears and defunding, and the failure of other Arab states to step up to the plate, Hamas's wait and see, let's let due process run its course and see if something changes, have all amounted to nothing changing, not from their perspective. So is it any wonder they've resumed rocket attacks? It's all they've got left, along with reminding Israeli civilians that their government are liars, and if they think they put the military arm of Hamas down, they really haven't. And the worst part of all of this is that the attacks involving Gazan civilians are only likely to increase now as a result, because Israel will now only redouble their efforts, and Western nations will only redouble their excuses to keep supporting the occupiers and the genocidalists. Following that hospital attack in Jenin in the West Bank being reported on today in some areas, with patients being killed where they lay by the IDF, we're already seeing it. There is no Hamas in the West Bank after all. This is an escalation. So often we hear that slogan, give peace a chance. It looks like Hamas gave it a month and the rest of the world just let them down by not upholding international law, not upholding a court judgment. The nations subject to those provisional orders has ignored them without consequence, and the rest of the Arab world, with the exception of the Houthis in Yemen, have just sat and watched. If international law is not upheld, then there is no international law. Instead, just a dictatorial international rules-based order, which does as it likes, and because the West is so invested in Israel, because Israel is so invested in them, that no matter what they do, they will be supported. It's not a fair fight. The only people following the ICJ ruling are the ones on the receiving end of this genocide. The loss of UNRWA will be the final nail in the coffin for Gaza. And if you want to find out more about how critical this aid agency is to the people of Gaza, and indeed the West Bank too, 6 million people all told rely on them, then you should watch this video next, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Keir Starmer has been outplayed by the Tories yet again. Did I say two-faced in the title, by the way? It must be at least 3 or 4 by now on this subject, because the man cannot lead, cannot take a position, not unless it's been handed to him by advisors or consultancies or focus groups that he is far, far too reliant on. Or he's just copying whatever the Tories do. It is a measure of just how awful a Prime Minister he would actually be, having reached the position he has by pretending to be everything he really isn't. And as more and more people start to realise that, the fewer and fewer people can actually stand him. On the matter of Palestine, though, he's excelled himself, having advocated for war crimes to be committed by Israel against Gaza, denying it, stepping away from recognising a Palestinian state, tearing up that decade-long Labour Party policy, changing his mind on that entirely again when Benjamin Netanyahu formally rubbished the idea of a two-state solution, then sticking to their new position of not recognising a Palestinian state, to now demanding a Palestinian state the moment unelected Foreign Secretary David Cameron has now suggested it, thus once more copying the Tories. If Starmer becomes PM, is he going to be getting Sunak to declare national policy for him just so he can keep on agreeing with it? Because the man cannot come up with anything on his own. He cannot lead on anything. Right, so Palestinian statehood. David Cameron has just floated the idea, but to my mind this just screams PR exercise. Cameron's background is in public relations. He always was one for pushing policy like a product advertising campaign. And he's really good at drawing attention to stuff like this and spinning it in a way that's favourable for him. Right now, he's identified the Muslim voter market, which is deserting Labour in droves. I'm not going to dig into Labour's Muslim voter woes in this video. That's enough to cover already. I'm going to cover that in a separate video later. It warrants its own video, so stay tuned for that. But Cameron has identified a gap in the market, so to speak, to exploit, and he knows offering Palestinian statehood will be attractive. Don't fall for it. He's a Tory. He's about as honest as Netanyahu will be on this matter. To give an idea of actually why Rishi Sunak needed to bring someone like Cameron in, such was the utterly lightweight and stupid assemblage of bloated, bloviating imbecillery that consists of his parliamentary party. Many are too stupid even now to see that this is just a ruse by Cameron, and have attacked him over it, saying it would be rewarding Hamas to grant Palestinian statehood. Never mind that Hamas are the elected government. Never mind that just because the UK sees Hamas as a terrorist state that other nations do as well. And never mind that the entire people are under occupation, Cameron doesn't mean it. He's wrong-footing Starmer, which is child's play functionally, but also at the end of the day, recognition of a Palestinian state by the UK needs to be as part of a global recognition of a Palestinian state. It would take a global effort to deliver that, and above all else, would require Israel being held to account, which in practice still isn't happening, as the ICJ ruling and provisional orders get abused and ignored. Say the Tories did mean it, though. They could put it in their manifesto, and I still wouldn't believe it, mind you. But if they did, with the strength of feeling amongst a majority of the country on this matter that has been completely out of lockstep amongst political leadership opinions, especially on Israel lobby bought and paid for Labour politicians, some 40% of whom it's being reported owe something to the Israel lobby somewhere along the line, it's an election battle line to be drawn. The Tories are the sort to pretend to be pro-Palestine while still arming Israel, of course. Hypocrisy means nothing to them. They can con a vote out of some of you, they will. Nevertheless, the media are carrying the story as many of you might expect them to, with many of them and their pro-Tory leanings reporting this as a big win for the Tories in Cameron's proclamation. But he's not Tory leader anymore, and there's no sign that I've seen of Sunak backing this up in any way. That said, Ambassador to the UK for Palestine, Hussam Zomlot, practically a household name now, such are his many and strong media outings to defend Gaza and what Israel are doing out there, has hailed Cameron's words, saying, "This is historic. It is the first time a UK Foreign Secretary considers recognising the state of Palestine, bilaterally and in the UN, as a contribution to a peaceful solution rather than outcome. A UK recognition is both a Palestinian right and a British moral, political, legal and historical responsibility. If implemented, the Cameron Declaration would remove Israel's veto power over Palestinian statehood, would boost efforts towards a two-state outcome, and would begin correcting the historic injustice inflicted on the Palestinian people by colonial Britain's Balfour Declaration." If only I could believe it like he appears to, though I surmise Dr. Zomlot is probably just as reticent as I am on the quiet. But now Labour are trying to associate themselves with this move, copying the Tories yet again, without shame, despite the words of their leader Keir Starmer still ringing in our ears that Israel does have that right to withdraw water and power, as he told Nick Ferrari on LBC. Those words, that interview, will haunt him for the rest of his days, and should by rights earn him a day in the dock for advocating for war crimes to be committed. But it was the words of the equally duplicitous and two-faced David Lammy who spelled out Labour's agreement with his Foreign Office counterpart's move. Not only that, but tried to claim credit for it. Lammy stood up in Parliament and he said, "For a decade now, the Labour Party has supported Palestinian recognition. As Keir Starmer has said, Palestinian statehood is not the gift of a neighbour, it is the inalienable right of the Palestinian people. I welcome the Foreign Secretary adopting this position and rejecting the notion that recognition can only follow the conclusion of negotiation." What a creep! Lammy is also on record as saying that recognising a Palestinian state was an unrealistic gesture. He's as opportunistic as Starmer, he's just been doing it for far longer. It was only the week before last that Labour formally dropped its position on all of this. But the moment the Tories picked it up, they now pretend no such thing happened at all. It is all so shameless, and they act as if people won't notice. But some of us spend an unhealthy amount of time noticing these things, and then we talk about it. All because the Tories announced this, Labour now think it is a good idea again. Listening to the Israel lobby too much likely put you all in this position to begin with. Damage limitation isn't going to wash. People's memories are not as short as you hope they are. Lammy's pathetic show in the Commons was not missed by the many commentators on such things. Former Corbyn advisor and journalist Steve Howell wrote, 2 weeks ago, Starmer ditched Labour's long-standing policy of recognising the state of Palestine. Today, faced with the Tories supporting recognition, Lammy acted as if the U-turn earlier in January had never happened. These people have no principles and no shame. The Liverpool Community Independence Group on Liverpool City Council, who are going to be standing a candidate against Labour right-winger Maria Eagle, wrote, Labour explicitly retreated from this policy 2 weeks ago. It said no recognition of Palestinian statehood unless Israel agrees. Starmer's party speaks out of two sides of its mouth and can't be trusted. And the Democracy Collaborative President Joe Guinan wrote, a reverse ferret from Labour. The sheer brazenness of this since Starmer just dropped recognition of a Palestinian state as Labour policy a couple of weeks ago. They are compulsive and constant liars. It was only the other week a member of Starmer's shadow cabinet, Wayne David, when Labour dumped the idea that he called recognition of Palestinian statehood T-shirt politics, and now we're supposed to believe they always supported the idea. Labour under Starmer and Lammy and the rest of these awful red Tories, utterly beholden to Israel lobby donations in far too many cases, have no principles, have no ideas of their own, can only copy what is already being done to this country, ruined by 14 years of the Tories, and they won't do anything differently. A vote for Labour cannot be seen as anything other than delivering power into the hands of people we don't know, who will face no accountability, shadowy figures acting behind them because of that. And we won't have a government working in our interests yet again. Both main parties are prepared to use Palestine as political football now, going into a general election, as people die out there still on a daily basis, thanks to an occupying force we the UK officially support, and are arming in no small part, that both main parties in fact support, and are likely complicit in genocide now as a result. Why would anyone consider either of these parties right now? I don't know. Because absolutely nothing will change no matter which one of them wins power at the general election. And if you watch this video here from the other week where I covered Starmer's dumping of the concept of Palestinian statehood, you can see in more detail just what a blatant liar he is on this issue now. Highly recommended highly recommended viewing even, of course, if you haven't already seen it. And I will hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Keir Starmer is now all of a sudden realising he's lost the Muslim vote, has he? Bit late now, isn't it? Starmer's been too busy listening to his pro-Israel backers to care, hasn't he? His declaration, denied ever since, but never apologised for, despite going out on national radio that Israel had the right to commit war crimes in Gaza through withdrawal of water and power, echoed around the country, echoed around the world, and has not been forgotten. People are organising against Starmer and some of his chief hangers-on with vulnerable majorities and seats with large Muslim populations. And now polling is being conducted by the party as alarm really sets in on how bad the Muslim voting demographic, something Labour has always been able to rely on, now is. There are large numbers of people who have supported Labour for years, despite being taken for granted that this is now the last straw, that this is a party that has gone too far, does not care about their Muslim brothers and sisters around the world, and therefore it's time they took their votes elsewhere. And alternatives are opening up for them. Right, so Labour losing the Muslim vote. This is a topic I've visited before, but necessitates revisiting on the basis that now all of a sudden somebody might have got it through Keir Starmer's thick Brill-cream skull that his party might have finally lost a key demographic on their way to the general election. They already need a far larger majority than the Tories do for a majority, due to boundary changes, due to campaign spending limit changes, and due to voter ID rules that the Tories have all brought in to hedge their own bets and favour themselves. So Labour can't afford to be losing anyone. And I genuinely don't think they thought they were. Their national polling being so ridiculously high, perhaps they bought into their own Kool-Aid. It's no wonder the Tories are trying to rig things like mad, but equally, Labour and whoever Starmer is listening to couldn't countenance anyone leaving their party, given the hack of things the Tories have made of pretty much everything. The economy, migration, housing, inflation, Brexit, you name it, they've stuffed it. But Starmer has too. And actually, it's too obvious to just go straight to the situation in Gaza here, that I think is the straw that broke the camel's back. We have to go back before that, because this has been a long time coming. Starmer, upon becoming leader, ostracised many on the left when it became readily apparent everything he had stood for was a lie going into that Labour leadership contest. That, of course, led to all the purges, ongoing accusations against many members for anti-Semitism. But no other form of racism was ever taken nearly as seriously as that was. That has been borne out in both the Labour Leaks report and the Ford report, which have both been roundly ignored insofar as their findings are concerned. Martin Ford KC found there was anti-black and Islamophobic racism within the party, and that it is not taken as seriously as anti-Semitism. This is shown for all to see on the Labour Party complaints page on their own website. If you care to go to take a look, if you go there, you can see a bespoke option for anti-Semitism complaints. But all other forms of racism have to use a general complaints page. It's blatant. As for the Labour Leaks report, which showed the appalling and often racist conduct of people working against the then Corbyn leadership, rather than focus on the actions evidenced, Starmer has obsessively wasted cash trying to find out who leaked the report instead. But there are so many more examples, and often these involve Starmer himself. 2 years ago, for example, on Twitter, Starmer put out a tweet referring to Islamist terrorism in remembrance of the death of Lee Rigby. What did the perpetrator's religion have to do with that? Rigby's family didn't want his death politicised, so away goes Starmer and does just that, of course. Associating Islam with terrorism, though, was appalling, and there was never any apology. Starmer doesn't do apologies. Racism has become a feature of Starmer's imposition of candidates too. Boundary changes saw his allies Steve Reed and Sarah Jones pick their new patches in London, whilst black left-wing MP Bel Ribeiro Addy has been shunted where she's been told to. 2 days after that, a selection was held in Copeland for the Labour candidate to stand there, and the local favourite was an Egyptian Muslim named Joseph Gayuba. After having to put up with the rancid anti-Corbyn MP Jamie Reid for so long, Labour had lost this seat and were keen to win it back, as you can imagine. But let the locals pick their own candidate. Starmer can have that. Well, Copeland CLP has been denied their choice because Starmer and co have, at the due diligence interview, produced a photo of Gayuba taken with a former Labour councillor. And the councillor in question had apparently waged a racist campaign against Gayuba, and is currently in prison having been convicted on child sex offences. Yet somehow Labour have deemed this to be Gayuba's fault, in that they've used it as their reasoning, or at least in part, to deny him a position on that Labour long list, thus leaving the way open for Starmer to parachute someone else in, whoever he likes, someone more of his sort. The entire Copeland CLP executive quit over that. Not the first time executives have gone by the wayside, and that's another issue for Starmer's election prospects, when so many experienced campaigners and organisers have left in disgust at him imposing candidates like he has been. Of course, since October 7th, things have only become more brazen, more obvious, more stark as to how anti-Muslim Starmer's party is. Not least Starmer himself. Remember his trip to Wales last October? He decided on a spur of the moment, after he'd been visiting Port Talbot, to drop in on a Muslim centre in South Wales, supposedly damage limitation after making that now infamous withdrawal of food and power comment on LBC. He said he managed to make it worse for himself by putting out a tweet saying, "I was grateful to hear from the Muslim community of the South Wales Islamic Centre. I repeated our calls for all hostages to be released, more humanitarian aid to enter Gaza, for the water and power to be switched back on, and a renewed focus on the two-state solution." Oh, the two-state solution was being bandied around then as well, wasn't it? I'd forgotten about that one. That's another two-faced ping-pong ball on that one, isn't it? Not that he meant it then he did again, then changed his mind, then David Cameron suggested it, and so Labour now backs it again. That's where I think we are. I might have missed a two-faced incident there. I don't know. Maybe. The worst of it was no doubt, though, that he told Muslims in South Wales to release the Hamas hostages. I don't think they were being held in Wales, Keith. All Muslims the same then, are they? You think they've all got a hotline to Hamas to do these things? Are they all Hamas to you? Never apologised for that either, did you? Starmer doesn't do apologies. The thing is, he clearly knows he has a problem here, but he can't help but keep making it worse. October and November see in Islamophobia Awareness Month, and last year was the first time in Starmer's thus far 4-year-long leadership, 4 years too long, where he chose to acknowledge it. So damage limitation again is at play. It's already on the cards here. Apologising for his conduct can't be part of that, though. He put out a video acknowledging Islamophobia Awareness Month, but without that apology, of course. It just underlined in the end all the previous times he's caused ire amongst Muslim communities and just made people more angry. Even when he has a chance to do something meaningful, he can't actually follow through. The words of the horrific Israeli ambassador to the UK, Zippy Ottaveli, the first sign the two-state solution was dead, as far as Israel was concerned, led to calls for Starmer to not appear with her anymore. But being the hardened, ardent Zionist without qualification that he is, Starmer has ignored that, and although, as far as I'm aware, he hasn't actually met with Ottaveli since, he hasn't said he won't either. All of this followed by his rhetoric backing Israel, backing war crimes, supporting them despite them conducting genocide right now, despite the ICJ ruling which Starmer again, and despite being a former human rights barrister, he still hasn't passed comment on. Has ignored the ICJ ruling really just as much as Israel have. So he has big problems, and to ascertain the scale of it, he's now polling Muslims to see just how bad things are. I can imagine that one of his more vulnerable skivvies, his shadow health minion, Wes Streeting, has squealed about how much bother he's in and something needs to be done, with 1 in 4 Streeting's constituents being Muslim, and them demonstrating on more than one occasion outside of his constituency office against his pro-Israel position. That Streeting is heavily funded by people with links to the Israel lobby, is a Labour friend of Israel too, and has an independent candidate selected by those organising against him within his constituency to see him lose his seat, and she's a British Palestinian woman at that, Liane Mohammed, making it all the more delicious a prospect of Streeting losing to exactly the sort of person he deserves to lose to. But Streeting is just one potential casualty. There are easily some 30 Labour seats where the Muslim vote makes a difference. One unnamed frontbencher, according to The Guardian, who have broken this story on this polling being conducted by Labour amongst Muslims, does seem to sum up the situation quite well. They've said, "We know we've lost the Muslim vote, and at the very least their trust. The Muslim community is no longer a safe voter base for us because of how we initially responded to the war. So we're just focused on damage control. We all know it. The Muslim vote has been one of the staunchest, most loyal Labour votes. And Starmer has blown it. It's not just Streeting that faces organised independent candidates running to unseat them. But as one of the most disliked Labour MPs going, there are few, aside from Starmer himself, who possibly deserve it more. So meet Liane Mohammed in this video here. She deserves the very best of luck. And the people of Ilford North certainly deserve an MP who actually represents them. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so the story of the IDF entering a hospital to kill 3 people alleged to be Hamas has been doing the rounds, and for many mainstream outlets that has been all there was to it. They were Hamas. They went into hospital, they took out opponents, and the Western world, or the leaders thereof, cheered their demise. They really shouldn't be cheering, and there is so much more to this story than that needs to be said. This wasn't justice, this was a sanctioned killing. These people weren't put on trial, didn't face actual justice, they were assassinated. And if you think that's the road to peace, then you're dafter than you look. This also didn't take place in Gaza, somewhat obvious given it was a hospital they entered. Gaza doesn't really have any that can be described as anywhere near as functional as this one for a start. This is in the West Bank, where the war isn't, at least not yet. There's a lot to unpack from this incident, not least the fact Israel, in the manner they conducted themselves here, have added an entirely new war crime to the list of allegations against them in the process. Right, so if you're a user of social media, a variety of social media platforms, and are following the goings on in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine, the video footage of these IDF soldiers entering the Ibn Sina specialised hospital in Jenin in the West Bank, where they assassinated 3 people purported to be Hamas operatives. One was supposedly a Hamas commander. Israel can't seem to beat them in the field, so they enter hospitals and shoot them where they lay in bed, it would appear. We had the spectacle of 3 IDF soldiers crossing our screens. This is a piece of video that we've seen. Apparently there were more than 3 that went into the hospital, but we had this spectacle of 3 IDF soldiers dressed as hospital workers, dressed in scrubs, surgical masks. The rifles gave them away still. I don't know what they hoped to achieve with their disguises exactly, carrying guns, but there you go. They went in, killed 3 men and left. The Western mainstream media reported this and basically gave the equivalent of a shoulder shrug. So let's flip the story a moment and see if they give the same reaction. Imagine 3 Hamas operatives dressed as hospital workers entered an Israeli hospital and killed 3 members of the IDF in their beds. Would the media let that go? Well, we know the answer to that, don't we? A hostage raid on October 7th has resulted in nearly 4 months of levelling the entire Gaza Strip, with Israel supporters saying they deserved it and helping to supply guns and other armaments in the form of aid to them. A massively disproportionate response, as we know. There would be global condemnation if this were Hamas doing this. Instead, nothing is said because it is Israel, and Israel must always be protected and held to a higher standard, it would seem. This wasn't justice. It might have been sanctioned by the Israeli state, but they faced the ICJ on charges of genocide themselves, so they aren't a responsible government, to say the least. This was a state-sanctioned death squad, an extrajudicial killing, sent in to kill people and disguised themselves whilst they did it. Hospitals have protected status in times of war. If you've been following this story for long enough, if you've been following my content on this for long enough, you know hospitals have protected status. They are never legitimate targets, and to target them in any way, shape or form, or anyone within them, is a war crime. The fact Israel have all but destroyed every single hospital in Gaza stands testament to why they belong in The Hague. But here we are, not in Gaza, not where the war is, not where Hamas operate even, if these men happen to be Hamas. We're in the West Bank, and a hospital has become a target there, or rather people within it, enjoying the protected status the hospital affords them. But this means nothing to Israel, who act with impunity, have violated that, committed yet another war crime against hospitals, and a whole new war crime whilst they were at it. How many times, I wonder, have Israel accused Hamas of hiding amongst civilians, dressing as civilians, not wearing uniforms in order to hide, and said they are committing war crimes by doing that? Well, here we have Israel on camera doing just that, dressed as hospital staff in order to commit these killings. And that's a war crime in and of itself. It's called perfidy. Perfidy is a war crime of deception. It is a promise to act in good faith, only to break it as soon as your enemy is vulnerable. Another example would be to raise a white flag, and as soon as your enemy comes out, drop the flag and shoot them. Perfidy is specifically prohibited in the Geneva Conventions under Article 37 of Protocol 1 additional to the Geneva Conventions of 1949, basically an amendment to it, including bits that were overlooked in the original conventions. I presume this is why they came into existence. But Article 37 states, Article 37, prohibition of perfidy. 1. It is prohibited to kill, injure or capture an adversary by resort to perfidy. Acts inviting the confidence of an adversary to lead him to believe that he is entitled to or is obliged to accord protection under the rules of international law applicable in armed conflict with intent to betray that confidence shall constitute perfidy. The following acts are examples of perfidy. A. The feigning of an intent to negotiate under a flag of truce or of a surrender. B. The feigning of an incapacitation by wounds or sickness. C. The feigning of civilian non-combatant status. And D. The feigning of protected status by use of signs, emblems or uniforms of the United Nations or of neutral or other states not parties to the conflict. 2. Ruses of war are not prohibited. Such ruses are acts that are intended to mislead an adversary or to induce him to act recklessly, but which infringe no rule of international law applicable in armed conflict, and which are not perfidious, because they do not invite the confidence of an adversary with respect to protection under that law. The following are examples of such ruses: the use of camouflage, decoys, mock operations, and misinformation. So by dressing as hospital workers, they've breached the Geneva Conventions again, namely in the instance of Article 37 of Protocol 1. Terrorists embedding themselves amongst the civilian population and disguising themselves as hospital workers. It's a headline any mainstream news channel would happily trot out if they were talking about Hamas. But it doesn't get spelt out that way when it's Israel, because they'll be the terrorists that we're backing, wouldn't they? Of course, we only have Israel's word that these 3 individuals killed in their hospital beds were, in fact, Hamas. I wonder, since Gaza and the West Bank are cut off from each other, and Gaza is surrounded by a border wall and has been for years, just how Hamas got their people into West Bank hospital beds, in where Jenin is. But so often the truth is not what Israel say it is. US news outlet Mondo Vice have reported on this incident, and their article on this matter paints a very different picture. We know Israel have been mounting attacks on the West Bank as well as Gaza, even though Hamas have no presence in the West Bank, and as usual the West turns a blind eye to it all. Jenin has been a target for months by Israel, as has the refugee camp situated there. Israel have targeted the city and the camp with drone strikes, and one of the people in the hospital was the victim of one such drone strike, having been hit, rendering him paraplegic and bound to a wheelchair. The other 2 people were his brother and their friend. Mondo allege all 3 were native to Jenin. Therefore, to say they are Hamas, that's a bit of a stretch, isn't it? CNN, though, very pro-Israel, it's been alleged they need to run their headlines past Israel before passing them on for publication. That's how pro-Israel they are. Claim one of the individuals was Hamas and the other 2 were Jenin Brigade fighters, one of the numerous disparate resistance groups that constitute Islamic Jihad in the West Bank. But this from CNN seems more likely to me to be just excuse making. I certainly wouldn't be taking their word for anything on what's going on in the Middle East right now. Whatever their allegiances, they were in a hospital protected under the Geneva Conventions, though, and they were attacked and killed in their sleep by IDF soldiers committing perfidy to do so, in violation of the Geneva Conventions. The 3 men killed were aged just 19, 24 and 28. War crimes have been committed here blatantly. Staff were assaulted on the way to the 3 men's room. Humanitarian law has been breached all in the days following the ICJ provisional orders and judgment that nations supportive of Israel won't enforce if they are also signatories of the Genocide Convention, and that Israel have brazenly declared they will continue to ignore. This is enabling terrorism. And when you add to that we only have the word of Israel over this incident, and it is treated as fact despite their repeated lies, just as we only have the word of Israel in relation to the UNRWA aid agency having 12 Hamas operatives on its staff, and look how quick the West was to cut funding off to the entire organisation over that. Well, where is the equally quick condemnation of these extrajudicial killings? Tumbleweed. Israel are continuing to act as if international law does not apply to them, and if the mainstream media and our politicians won't keep pointing it out, then it is up to us instead. Gaza are already appearing to have given up hope of the ICJ orders making any difference, since they have now resumed rocket attacks on Israel for the first time this year, having stopped the attacks since South Africa brought their genocide case against Israel. And if you watch this video next, you can hear all about this resumption in rocket fire by Hamas, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so all that funding to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, that had been stopped by an assemblage of countries, not least us here in the UK, by Rishi Sunak, aided and abetted, of course, in that by Keir Starmer, that threatens mass starvation, famine and almost certainly death, has, it would appear, been blown apart once again as a big fat stinky Zionist lie. We were told 12 members of the 15,000 strong aid force in Gaza that worked for UNRWA had worked for Hamas in the lead up to October 7th. But much like Israel were unable to tell us how many Hamas operatives died that night and how many of their own did as they set fire to everything, and as a result took 6 weeks to realise they'd counted 200 more Israeli bodies than they meant to, unable to tell Israeli from Gaza, incriminating themselves as the alleged arsonists, they've apparently miscounted here too. Those 12 people that have seen an entire aid agency at a time of genocide defunded, turns out it might only have been 4. And it gets even worse than that. Right, so UNRWA's defunding by a host of countries from the UK to the US, Canada, Italy and more has been met with widespread derision that they are pulling funding entirely from an organisation which is the last line in meeting the basic needs of the Palestinian population in both Gaza and the West Bank and elsewhere besides. It was established in 1949 following the Nakba to provide assistance and protection to Palestinian refugees, and is almost entirely run on donations, much of which come from other countries. So the pause in donations from some of the wealthiest and biggest of their donors has been crippling. It's been catastrophic. And it's made all the more pathetic when you consider that this has been based on pathetically little evidence, and even that now has been watered down. Pausing aid is basically aiding and abetting in the war crime of collective punishment, since those affected are completely innocent. If a group of bankers got caught collectively embezzling funds, the entire bank doesn't get shut down, does it? Yet an aid agency in the thick of the biggest humanitarian catastrophe we've seen in decades? Sure, and all because Israel says so. If you want a great example of just how wet the West is being over this, then you won't find a more pro-Israel lickspittle for the Netanyahu regime than US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who has completely embarrassed himself on this UNRWA matter. Because despite making claims publicly that the evidence produced by Israel is highly credible, he also admitted to the fact he hasn't actually seen it. At a press conference he said, "We haven't had the ability to investigate the allegations ourselves, but they are highly credible." Well, how can you possibly know that, you total balloon? And as it turns out, like most Israeli claims, which should only ever be taken with a pinch of salt unless independently verified, it's turned out to be anything but credible. We have been told for days now that there were 12 individuals accused of aiding Hamas in their actions on the night of October 7th, individuals who worked for UNRWA, yet now Israeli intelligence documents have come out saying that actually it was 4. Will that number go down further? Well, who would bet against it? Further accusations now claim that 10% of UNRWA are Hamas, and 50% of them are first-degree relatives of a Hamas operative. They are also now alleging that UNRWA is forced to work under the directive of Hamas, that UNRWA were involved in transferring fuel to the north of the Gaza Strip to aid Hamas, and that UNRWA facilities are used to store Hamas weaponry. It's an excuse they've come out with a lot to justify the wholesale destruction of the Gaza Strip. The ICJ ruling issued a provisional order to restore infrastructure, but of course Israel have not done that. This is all easily debunked too, and even Sky, who have reported on this, on the issuing of these Israeli intelligence documents, make it clear they've seen no evidence to actually back any of these documents up. And it says a lot that even a mainstream news source feels compelled to cover itself on such matters, when national intelligence documents, you would figure, from any credible democratic nation, would be pretty much beyond doubt. But with Israel, everything has to be doubted. Sky's statement reads, "The Israeli intelligence documents make several claims that Sky News has not seen proof of, and many of the claims, even if true, do not directly implicate UNRWA. As far as the accusations made against UNRWA staff, UNRWA shares a list of its staff with all UN nations, including Israel, every single year, in order to have maximum transparency against such accusations." Now, of course, there has been plenty of condemnation of the countries that have withdrawn funding, now totaling 16 of them, all based on nothing but worthless words. And if this funding remains withdrawn, UNRWA do not believe they will be able to continue beyond the end of this month. They've issued a statement, the latter part of which reads, "When presented with serious allegations by Israeli authorities that some UNRWA staff were involved in the 7th of October abhorrent attacks on Israel, UNRWA Commissioner General took the decision to immediately terminate the appointment of these staff in the interest of the agency and seized the UN Office of Internal Oversight Services in New York, which launched an investigation. Full accountability and transparency are expected out of this process, should the allegations be substantiated." Shortly after the UNRWA announcement, a number of donor countries suspended $440 million worth of funding to the agency. As the war in Gaza is being pursued unabated, and at the time the International Court of Justice calls for more humanitarian assistance, it is the time to reinforce and not to weaken UNRWA. The agency remains the largest aid organisation in one of the most severe and complex humanitarian crises in the world, said UNRWA Commissioner General Philippe Lazzarini. I echo the call of the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to resume funding to UNRWA. If the funding remains suspended, we will most likely be forced to shut down our operations by end of February, not only in Gaza, but also across the region. UNRWA provides assistance to Palestine refugees in the Gaza Strip, West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Thankfully, there is a growing list of countries prepared to buck the trend of funding abandonment by increasing theirs. Belgium, Luxembourg, Ireland, Norway, Spain, Scotland, and Slovenia have all publicly refused to cut funding to UNRWA. In fact, in Spain's case, they've trebled it. So how did the number of accused people end up falling from 12 to 4 anyway? Well, this just goes to show why you can't believe what Israel have to say on the matter. Of the 12 accusations, 2 of the staff accused were dead, 1 other hasn't been identified, and 1 more didn't even work for UNRWA, since their name didn't match any of the staff lists that UNRWA make available to UN member nations. That leaves 8. All 8 were dismissed immediately by UNRWA without any prior investigation, which I think is poor. But as I've said previously, my mindset is a Western one where employment is concerned, and I'm not going to comment on how that is being handled here in the Middle East. Nonetheless, though, with the number of accusations having fallen to 4, it looks like 4 former UNRWA workers might be entitled to ask for their job back. Though if funding's not restored, there won't be a job to return to in a month's time anyway. The United Nations Office of Oversight Services, or OIOS, is investigating this, so it'll be interesting to see how they resolve this mess. They need to work pretty fast, though, if UNRWA is going to be saved. If UNRWA falls, it'll be a death sentence for thousands, potentially millions of people, since UNRWA looks after the needs of some 6 million people right now. UN nations who bring this about will again be complicit in war crimes brought about by their loyalty to Israel instead of basic humanity, and when literally nothing Israel says seems to have any truth attached to it, it makes it all the more pathetic and risible and condemnable. Put all of this in context of Israel's attitude to UNRWA as well. This accusation against 12 aid workers came out 24 hours after the ICJ ruling. So it's as if they had it teed up ready to go, knowing what the likely outcome of the court would be. So let's switch attention onto something else. Well, it's not going to go the way you hoped, guys. Your dossier is meaningless without associated evidence, and the alleged evidence this has all come from has come from alleged Hamas operatives interrogated by Shin Bet, who are notorious for using torture to extract confessions. That's if there's any evidence at all. Israel have been trying to undermine UNRWA for years after all, and they're succeeding thanks to idiots in power, too stupid or too compromised to act with minds of their own. All of this defunding omits to take into account Israel's long-standing grievance against this aid agency, which acts as a thorn in its side, and especially omits a story published in the Times of Israel, likely buried somewhat as it came out the same day the South Africa application was filed in its genocide case against Israel, 29th of December of last year. And this article, though, published a 3-point plan from a leaked Israeli Foreign Ministry report to push UNRWA out of Gaza. The first part of this plan, funnily enough, involves producing a comprehensive report on alleged UNRWA cooperation with Hamas. Oh, how wonderful are these 16 countries to fall for that one hook, line and sinker. According to the Times of Israel article, the next stage would see reduced UNRWA operations in the Palestinian enclave amid a search for a different organisation to provide education and welfare services. In the third stage, according to the report, all of UNRWA's duties will be transferred to the body governing Gaza following the war. It is embarrassing how quickly some of our leaders rush to support Israel even now. Every last one of them deserves a day in The Hague for it. This Israeli master plan to destroy the last line of support for millions of vulnerable people has to be restored. It has to be prevented from happening. And while Israel has been looking for new ways to undermine the plight of Gaza and making accusations against UNRWA over Hamas, Hamas have only just this week resumed firing rockets into Israel since they've been allowing time to give due process a chance. But what hope can they or anyone else in Gaza have when for too many Western leaders, all Israel have to do is say jump for them to say how high? Watch this video next to get the story on Hamas's self-imposed ceasefire that has now ended, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Keir Starmer's Muslim voter problems. As some of you will know, he's currently polling Muslim voters just to see how big of a problem he's made for himself in regards to backing genocide in Gaza. His denial of ever doing that, despite it being caught on film, his subsequent failure to apologise for that, and of course his support for everything Israel has done ever since, right up to supporting the decision by the government to cut off financial and humanitarian aid to UNRWA. Starmer, as we know, needs to have his hand held before he makes a decision on anything, be it from Peter Mandelson or a focus group or one of those expensive consultancies he relies on. In case you wondered why Labour seems so desperate for money all of the time, and the problem with that is you have no concept of whether the advice you're being given is good or bad. And as far as Muslim voters go, and I covered a lot of the reasons behind Muslim voters deserting Labour in a video just yesterday, but the consequences of that, deciding to take Muslim voters for granted, deciding that Labour can afford to lose some of its voters by continuing to lead the party against their interests, doing things that they find grossly offensive, well, I expected Starmer's poll when it finally comes out, if it comes out into the public realm, if it's really bad, it probably won't, would show things are bad, but actually things are terminal, because Muslim voters are now organising for themselves and giving up on mainstream entirely. And I'd argue we'd all do well to do just the same. Right, so Starmer's poll will undoubtedly show things are very bad for Labour amongst Muslim voters, whether they choose to tell us or not, a base they've long taken for granted. It's not just Labour that turns Muslim voters off, of course, so do the Tories. It was only a fortnight ago that Cameron, Sunak and James Stupidly attended a Conservative Friends of Israel dinner. You don't ever hear so much about the Tory version of LFI, do you? But it's there and present. Along with them at said dinner was the UK ambassador to Israel, who said the two-state solution was dead. Zippy Hotovely. She should have been expelled from the country after that. Instead, she's still able to hobnob with the Prime Minister himself, along with the respective Foreign and Home Secretaries. There are 30,000 people dead at the hands of Zionism in Gaza, and neither Sunak nor Starmer bat an eyelid at it. And as much as I'm focusing on the Muslim voter response here, because of what is actually happening in that demographic, which I will come on to, they aren't the only ones grossly offended by the conduct of the government and the main opposition party walking in lockstep with them every step of the way with what is going on in Israel and in Gaza. The Starmer shadow cabinet arguably even more devoted to Israel, and certainly devoted to funding from pro-Israeli sources than the Tories are. So changing government from Tories to Labour won't make the blindest bit of difference to anyone offended by what is happening in the Middle East. Muslim voter and non-Muslim voter alike. So what are the Muslim voters going to do about it then, Damo? Well, they've been busy organising as it happens. Not that the mainstream news are covering this at all. Whilst Labour sources are dismissive of lost Muslim voters, reportedly referring to losing a few of them as shaking off fleas, reinforcing the already demonstrated, as per the Ford report, knowledge that the party is riddled with Islamophobia, not taken as seriously as anti-Semitism, which appears to be the only form of racism in existence to Labour, or the only one they care about or that matters. Muslim voters have got together, have been mobilising, and have set up a whole new entity which went public on the 19th of December last year, so is barely more than a month old. And it's called the Muslim Vote, or TMV. These guys mean business. They already have the endorsements of, for example, the Muslim Association of Britain, the Muslim Council of Scotland, the Muslim Council of Wales, Muslim Engagement and Development, MEND, Prevent Watch, and a lot more. Their mission statement reads, "This election signals a shift. Muslim issues at the forefront. We will no longer tolerate being taken for granted. We are a powerful, united force of 4 million acting in unison. We are focused on seats where the Muslim vote can influence the outcome. We're here for the long term. In 2024, we will lay the foundations for our community's political future." They can back this claim up too, it would seem, if you cast a cursory glance across their website, the muslimvote.co.uk. They're focused on seats where the Muslim vote can influence the outcome, and are looking at seats where basically more than 10% of the voting public identify as Muslim, which according to their website at the moment is 102 constituencies, although Scottish seats have not yet been added to that. Certainly enough to influence the outcome of an election at first look. Not all of those seats, of course, will be currently held by an MP who voted against the ceasefire or abstained on it, but it is very much what drove TMV into existence. That vote on the 15th of November last year, where 81% of MPs didn't back a ceasefire in Gaza. It's the straw that broke the camel's back. So in light of this knowledge, TMV proposed to apply themselves and their thousands of declared volunteers and campaign supporters in these constituencies. They're offering support to Muslims in other seats too in a whole host of different ways. They will be advising Muslims as to whether there is a party candidate who has voted for the ceasefire and is worth them supporting, or whether they need to select and put up an independent candidate between them to serve their needs and their area who actually will back such a thing. They will help people to do this from beginning to end, with seasoned campaign organisers on hand to go through electoral data and offer training and political education. They'll help with the onerous work covering things like due diligence, selection panels, asking the right sort of questions of potential candidates. They're coordinating support between groups across the country via social media and WhatsApp. They've got volunteers on hand to help with all manner of aspects of campaigning, from website developers, graphic designers, campaign literature producers, thousands of volunteers prepared to go doorstepping or do phone banking, to social media promotion. They've got data crunchers to help with local polling. They have funding they can make available to various areas. Muslims funding the campaigns of Muslim candidates for Muslim interests. When for so long they have been failed by mainstream parties and are fully covered legally, with multiple legal organisations prepared to work pro bono to meet any snags that may arise. They've built all of this up in a couple of months. If that doesn't tell you how angry the Muslim population of Britain is right now, I really don't know what will. And Labour and Tory politicians alike should be shuddering over this. But Keir Starmer most of all, as TMV described his Labour Party as being 30,000 dead Gazans too late to suddenly pretend they care about Muslim voter interest now. And that TMV are not just here for the election, but they're here for the long term. Look at it this way, in terms of Starmer's problems. He has this whacking great polling lead nationally, as we've seen various pollsters say. Going into an election year, it's clearly his to lose then. But by hemorrhaging the Muslim vote, he's well on his way there. And there is historical precedent for Labour losing the support of this demographic. Following the Iraq War, Labour lost vast swathes of its Muslim vote. Yet it had recovered enough of it by 2015 that they'd won 64% of the Muslim vote at that year's election. Under Jeremy Corbyn, that rose to 80%. So I look forward to seeing Starmer's poll just to see how much damage he's actually done. But there's polling we can look at right now, showing the vulnerability at least of even very safe Labour seats to a concerted, united Muslim vote being taken elsewhere. So let's look at two examples. First, let's look at Ilford North, which is the seat of Wes Streeting. Streeting is horrible. Streeting is pro-NHS privatisation, pro-Israel, and funded by those with links to both private health and the Israel. He's everything wrong with the Labour Party, and his majority is only 5,000. Starmer's problem is that with his polling, he'd expect Streeting's majority to soar, with the Tories on their backsides in the national polls. But instead, we're having conversations about him potentially losing his seat instead, such as the power of the Muslim vote and the Muslim vote in his seat. An independent candidate has already been selected to stand against him, Liane Mohammed, a British Palestinian who is ardently pro-Palestine independence, pro-ceasefire, pro a fully funded nationalised NHS. Everything Streeting is. The Muslim population of Ilford North is a massive 31%, nearly 1 in 3. And you just can't picture them voting for Streeting when he keeps backing Israel like he has done. Equally, they'd be most inclined to not vote at all, however, if they didn't feel there was a candidate worth backing. So by standing Liane Mohammed, who has been told on the doorstep to get Streeting out, such has been the positive reception to her candidacy, the Streeting might be in real bother. 31% of Ilford North's voter base is equivalent on 2019 figures to 22,618 people. Streeting won his seat in 2019 by getting just 25,323 votes. Many of those will have been Muslim votes that he likely isn't going to get next time round. He is extremely beatable and pretty much would only need the Muslim vote to come out to do it, because many other people there are just as sick of him. Let's do another example. You might remember the massive protests running through Bethnal Green and Bow following the ceasefire vote, the incumbent MP Rushanara Ali also failing to back a ceasefire. Well, she has a gigantic majority, a majority of 37,524. But she also has the 6th highest Muslim population per constituency in the country at 40.1%. She might have secured 44,052 votes in 2019, but there are 35,355 Muslim votes based on those figures up for grabs on her patch. And she will have had a disproportionate number of them, which, should Muslims there get organised around human rights lawyer Tasneem Akunji, even a majority as large as hers isn't unbeatable. Akunji has said of Rushanara Ali's actions, "I am standing because the incumbent did not give a voice to her constituents. She's a puppet on a string for Starmer. The party system is now a force against democracy rather than a force for democracy." And he's absolutely right, of course. TMV reckon as many as 55 constituencies can have their seats change hands by virtue of the power of the Muslim vote that both major parties have pretty much lost. If you want to get involved with TMV, then go visit themuslimvote.co.uk and go from there. If you want further incentive, even as Labour are conducting this polling, according to The Guardian, Labour sources are saying as long as Labour remains more than 20 points ahead in the polls, nothing Muslim voters do will matter. Care to prove them wrong? Meanwhile, if you want a reminder of at least a good many of the times Starmer and co have screwed over the Muslim vote, explaining why Starmer has lost the Muslim vote and deserves nothing less, frankly, check out this video here. His is a party in damage limitation mode. But they deserve everything they get, in my view. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Israeli planes have been coming here to the UK since the atrocities of October 7th broke out. We've heard nothing about this, I hear you cry, but this is what the latest investigation by Declassified UK have discovered, begging the question, what could they possibly be coming here for? It's a long way, after all, especially during a time where they claim to be fighting for their existence against a brutal, dissident force determined to wipe them all out, laying on the woe is us card, even as they respond to a one-night attempted hostage grab with 4 months of levelling the Gaza Strip, rendering vast areas uninhabitable and killing some 30,000 people. Clearly, this country is playing a role of some kind and has been playing that role for some time, and the government definitely has questions to answer if we have yet more reason to assume that the UK has been enabling, aiding and abetting genocide even more than we might previously have already thought. Right, so Israeli planes coming to the UK, why on earth could they be coming so far? If Israel needed to come to a UK airbase for whatever reason, there's one on Cyprus and others dotted about between here and there, or there's too much attention being brought to flights coming in and out of RAF Akrotiri on Cyprus for Israel to so blatantly be landing there too. Well, we know the US has been using that UK RAF base to fly in and out of Israel on missions doing we know not what, gathering intelligence, dropping off supplies maybe. Who knows? It has even been surmised that they've been facilitating the transport of weaponry and other armaments from our base on Cyprus, not to mention the attacks by the US and UK on Houthis blockading shipping in Yemen, and at the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in the south of the Red Sea. They've been launched from Cyprus to there too. Certainly the local Cypriots think we've been up to no good. They're aiding and abetting Israel from their island. They've been protesting on Cyprus against Israel and for a free Palestine, just as much as we've seen protests and demonstrations here and elsewhere around the world for the same reason. They've even gone right up to the gates of the RAF base itself to voice their displeasure, and whilst the UK government maintains that it is a matter of national security, they do not comment on the comings and goings of the military for that reason. But that does nothing to satisfy those of us deeply concerned with what is happening out there in Gaza, who know what a bunch of lying chances our government are. The main opposition leadership is on these matters as well, not to mention the US and Israel too. The only thing people trust is what they see for themselves these days via social media, this genocide being the first playing out in history unedited before our very eyes, or via independent media exposing what the mainstream media refuse to, because if they aren't covering it, somebody doesn't want you to know about it. Which of course brings me on to the stellar work of Declassified UK, one of the outlets which has covered a lot of the comings and goings from that RAF base, RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus. A lot of what we know has been going on there has come from their work, their journalism, investigative journalism, and it's certainly the first that I picked up on covering this story. And again, they've done likewise with this one here too, identifying these flights from Israel, landing at bases or coming and going from bases here on the British mainland. Since October 7th, they've identified 6 flights from Israel, Israeli Air Force aircraft visiting the British mainland. They suspect there have been far more flights, but the Ministry of Defence refuses to confirm or deny such flights have been coming here, won't answer how many visits all told have come, won't answer what they've come here for. The Declassified have identified flight logs, as I said, of at least 6 flights, confirming they have been happening, and confirming Israeli military aircraft have landed a total of 6 times at minimum on the British mainland since October 7th at 4 different locations. The first record they became aware of was a flight out of Glasgow Prestwick in Scotland on the 18th of November last year. There's no record of the flight ever having arrived. The flight log for that has not been kept, is missing for some reason. But the flight log of the aircraft leaving IAF 680, IAF standing for Israeli Air Force, left Glasgow Prestwick at 1 p.m. that day and arrived 5 hours later in Beersheba, Israel. I'll come back to that destination in a moment. It's not exactly as well known as Tel Aviv, but this was around the time the ceasefire vote fell in Parliament, of course. So what had we become involved with by this point, and did that have any bearing on how MPs tended to vote? We can't know, because they won't say what these aircraft were doing here. They won't even confirm what sort of aircraft they were, lest that give the game away too, I presume. A big air freighter would imply stuff getting transported, wouldn't it? I wonder what sort of stuff that might have been. Perhaps it's troops, but we don't have boots on the ground in Israel, do we? Do we? All raises questions, however you look at it, doesn't it? That destination of Beersheba, though. Beersheba in Israel is home to the IAF's Nevatim Air Base, lying in the Negev Desert just south of the West Bank. The base has been a central node for the US to deliver bombs and other armaments to. In fact, the very first shipment of such armaments delivered to Israel following the night of October 7th was delivered to Nevatim Air Base on October 11th. The base is home to the equivalent of America's Air Force One as well, though they call theirs the Wing of Zion. Not too on the nose, is it? At any rate, this base has a track record of being a drop-off point for armaments since October 7th. Now, the second flight Declassified became aware of was that of another unidentified Israeli Air Force aircraft, though eyewitnesses state it was a Boeing 707, and it left Birmingham on December 2nd, again bound for Nevatim. And this model plane in question is known to be able to carry both passengers and freight. But the only reason this plane ended up in Birmingham at all was because it got diverted from its intended destination here, which was RAF Mildenhall in Suffolk, which is a US airbase. It's actually home to the second largest concentration of US troops in the UK, and, well, the US wanted to put boots on the ground, which there have been allegations of. There's more than 4,000 of their military personnel there waiting to be deployed if needs be. Over the following fortnight, another 2 flights left RAF Mildenhall, bound for Israel. The first one went to Nevatim, and the second one went to Dover. And no, I'm not talking about Dover in Kent. It's not ferrying Rishi Sunak about. That's the sort of flight he'd take, wouldn't it? But Dover in Delaware, in the US. Both very different, but with one crucial thing in common. Both see an awful lot of freight passing through. Dover, Delaware, however, is more air freight, military at that, being home to the US Department of Defense's largest air freight facility, and is also home to the 436th Airlift Wing, a unit of the US Air Force which, as the name implies, as one of its duties, facilitates the movement of outsized cargo worldwide. That first shipment of weapons that arrived in Nevatim on October the 11th from the US, it left Dover on October 10th. Finally, the sixth flight declassified had picked up on was an Israeli flight landing at RAF Brize Norton in Oxfordshire on Christmas Day. It had flown from Nevatim, and after a brief stopover it continued on the rest of its flight. Its destination? Dover, Delaware. Again, the type of plane it was has been kept secret. Are we being used as a layover, a stopgap point to facilitate the movement of armaments between the US and Israel? Certainly possible. Certainly looking at the departure points and the destinations. Same can be said of troop movements too. Now the US and the UK have other bases dotted throughout Europe as well, but would it be a bit too obvious to use them the closer they would be to Israel? On the other hand, can both the US and Israel, since the UK government and main opposition are utterly loyal to both, know they can avoid awkward questions by using the UK as a go-between point, knowing that the media will ignore it and the government will deny it or claim national security as an excuse not to speak up, and the opposition Labour Party certainly won't question it? That's entirely believable too, isn't it? And as such, declassified and other independent media who have covered this are very much proving their value, so this is stuff we all ought to know about, but wouldn't if not for them. What is being done in our name here? Most of the UK, contrary to Rishi Sunak's pathetic opining, are not on the side of Israel anymore. The scale of devastation, the massive loss of life, the completely disproportionate response to the night of October 7th, having very much left Israel completely exposed, pariahs, facing potential charges of genocide at the ICJ, and really opening up the plight of the Palestinian people up to a level it's never before been allowed to be. And that's because we've all become our own media to an extent or another. A media beyond state control at that. And it would be a very dark, very fascistic move for any government to try and come in and clamp down on any of that now. Too late. Genie's out of the bottle. We're clearly facilitating something for Israel right now. They wouldn't be flying here and there if not. And given what they are continuing to do right now, we need to know what. We deserve to know what, because I very much doubt it is anything good. And certainly not anything designed to bring about the end of the genocide we're observing still in Gaza, possibly leaves us open to more charges of aiding and abetting in a genocide. Perhaps things have just got a bit hot on Cyprus militarily at any rate. Does it ever get cold in Cyprus? I don't know. At any rate, the protests there by Cypriots demanding the UK get off their island, under the belief their actions are making their homes a military target for launching attacks from there against Yemen, don't help the presumptions that many people will make that the UK hasn't slowed down one bit in its support for Israel. Still, and you can learn all about that in this video here, which I highly recommend you watch, and I'll hope to catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Keir Starmer's typical heavy-handedness with those MPs brave enough to defy his diktat now means any suspensions handed out at this point in time by his regime and going forwards in all likelihood means they won't have a job for much longer, with a general election likely within the next few months. It's not like Starmer shifts very quickly to get these things dealt with after all, and you cannot but help think that that is intentional, given who many of these suspended people are. Of course, if that is the case, and these people know the writing is on the wall, they can use what time they have left to absolutely hammer Starmer, couldn't they? Such is the short-sightedness of his plotting here, perhaps. The diktat in question at this point, though? Well, this could be on anything at this point, but we can point to defying his stance on Israel and Palestine as one definite reason. Starmer is avowedly and unshakably pro-Israel. 30,000 Gazan deaths at Israel's hands haven't budged him an inch, even as the Tories discuss Palestinian state recognition. They'll believe that and you'll probably believe anything. Being pro-Palestine is already being used as a reason to deselect MPs, meaning a future Labour government will be more pro-Israel than ever before. And we've got examples of that happening right now. Right, so, Keir Starmer is Israel's man. Well, colour me surprised, Damo, tell us something new. Regular viewers might be thinking to themselves, but there does appear to be a concerted effort to push out Labour MPs that can probably be reasonably described as an awkward squad for Starmer, since these pesky people will insist on being on the left, will demonstrate sympathy and backing for the Gazan people at that, as genocide is committed against them. How dare these people show some humanity and a conscience? You can imagine the former human rights lawyer himself, thinking that. Any semblance of humanity and those former legal beliefs he might once have been in possession of, now long since apparently sold to the highest Israel lobby bidder. The difference in his attitude towards Ukraine and that of Gaza stands out like a sore thumb. Well, it's being reported that patience in the Whip's office, with Labour MPs apparently freelancing against the party line, is causing patience in the Whip's office to wear thin. The Whip's office, eh? They wouldn't be acting of their own accord on this, would they? That would be freelancing against the party line as well, wouldn't it? They get their orders just as much as other Labour MPs do. Let's not pretend it's the Whip's office whose patience is wearing thin. It is the patience of Keir Starmer, or perhaps even Peter Mandelson, whoever elected him. Perfectly believable, though, isn't it? By the Whip's office, of course. With a general election on the way, these threats now carry more weight, though, because if the brill-creamed exalted one doesn't deign to visit upon thee his forgiveness, then the MP in question, whoever that might be, is as good as gone. You can't stand for election for the party for as long as you are suspended by the party, after all. Very easy way for Starmer to get rid of anybody he doesn't want. You only need to look at the list of former Labour MPs currently sitting as independents to realise that. Jeremy Corbyn, of course, is the obvious one that springs to mind. Cleared of anti-Semitism by the NEC, then summarily suspended by Starmer himself in an abuse of his executive powers. He's far from alone in there being a number of left-wing MPs who have been punished for putting what is right and the needs of their own constituents before party interests. After all, constituents are meant to come first, aren't they? Well, that certainly isn't true under Keir Starmer. Diane Abbott, for example, remains suspended for coming on for a year now, has no expectation of the whip being restored before the election, all over the wrong version of a letter being sent out, which he retracted and apologised for, but still got suspended because Starmer frankly sniffed an opportunity. Other lefties that Starmer has found opportunity to potentially rid himself of include Andy MacDonald and Claudia Webb, and now, of course, Kate Ossamore has joined them. 3 black women there when the party continues to face accusations of anti-black racism, but Starmer really doesn't seem to care about that, does it? Actually, it's what has happened to Kate Ossamore that, in part, leads me into this notion of pro-Palestine deselections. Ossamore, of course, was suspended because on Holocaust Memorial Day last week, she put out a message of remembrance where she included what is happening in Gaza, along with the Holocaust and other genocides that are remembered on that day, such as Cambodia, Rwanda and Bosnia. The pro-Israel groups squealed, evidently. Starmer jumped. Ossamore was told to make an apology by the whips, and then all of a sudden she was suspended anyway, despite having done exactly what was asked of her. Smacks of somebody behind the scenes deciding here was an opportunity to rid themselves of another left-wing MP again. Someone chosen by her community that Labour behind the scenes have decided to do away with on the basis, I can only assume, that she isn't Starmery enough. She believed in something for herself, God forbid. She's not alone in the way she thought, though. And here's where things take a turn for the more sinister. And that brings me on to a Labour MP who is still a Labour MP at time of writing, though may not be for very much longer. Tahir Ali might not be the first Labour MP you think of. He's the MP for Birmingham Hall Green, was first elected in 2019, so he's still serving his first term as an MP, and if Starmer gets his way, it sounds like it will be his only term. Ali stood up in Parliament at PMQs just this week and accused Rishi Sunak of having blood on his hands following the verdict of the International Court of Justice and provisional measures that have been laid down by them against Israel. Ali shamefully was jeered on both sides, both by the Tories and others in his own party for what he said, and like Ossamore, he was made to make an apology too. However, he, at least at time of writing, which is several days later, has not had the whip removed as Kate Ossamore did. Double standards, perhaps, but when neither of them were actually wrong, they shouldn't have been punished at all. We are selling weapons and armaments to Israel in this country. We are manufacturing parts for their aircraft. Heck, their aircraft are coming here and the government won't tell us why. We are aiding and abetting what is happening in the Gaza Strip by Israel. And Sunak can point at Ali and say, look at the face of the Labour Party now, whilst shaking his head. But he deserves his day in The Hague for complicity along with a number of others. The thing is, though, despite Tahir Ali not being suspended, yet anyway, it seems Labour have no intentions of re-selecting him and are determined to ensure that will not happen. An anonymous Labour source, one of those, admittedly, spoke to Politics Home and told them the whips have assured people that Tahir will not be selected. But isn't that up to his constituents? Isn't that up to his constituency Labour Party? Ah, yes, the CLP, the constituents. Well, electoral interference has defined Starmer's leadership, hasn't it? Seeing entire constituency Labour Party executives quit en masse on multiple occasions as London Labour and Starmer and his ilk, his team, interfere to bring about Starmer's desired outcome in selections. And it has happened so often and so blatantly now that they are emboldened enough to tell the press that that is exactly what is going to happen here before they've even done it. However, Labour could be as good as throwing the seat away if they do go down this road with Ali. We know Muslim voters are getting organised right now, as I covered in a video yesterday, with a new organisation called the Muslim Vote. Muslims basically organising who to vote for, putting up their own candidates if needs be to ensure their views don't continue to get ignored. And Ali's seat of Birmingham Hall Green has the second highest constituency concentration of Muslim voters in the country. 49.9% of people there identify as Muslim, 1 in 2 basically. And right now they have an MP speaking up for them. But Labour are telling them they're going to deny him as a vote option to them at the next election because he is standing up for Muslims, standing up for the people of Gaza. Tahir Ali has a majority of 28,508. But with over 40,000 Muslims living in his seat, Labour can easily lose that, despite that majority, with a concerted, organised effort. Twitter, as ever, has had its say, condemning Starmer and co for their plotting and their actions against Keir Starmer and Tahir Ali. Joe Skeeping has written, "Old enough to remember when a party threatening its own MPs with deselection was a terrifying and sinister plot against democracy that merited front-page national news coverage." Well, indeed, it's very, very true. Curtis Daly from the Turn Left YouTube channel, excellent channel by the way, you should come over there and watch his stuff, wrote, "Absolutely vile from Labour, deselecting 2 MPs of colour for standing up for Palestinians. Everything they accuse Corbyn of, Stalinist dictatorship as leader, is true of Starmer. I will never vote Labour with these sort and I totally associate myself with that comment as well." And Socialist Voice writes, "Labour is institutionally racist under Sir Keir Starmer. 2 MPs of colour are to be deselected by pro-genocide Zionists as punishment for condemning Israel's war crimes in Gaza. Nearly 30,000 Palestinians killed. One would never believe Labour is led by a human rights lawyer." And doesn't that just sum it all up? I've said it before and I will say it again. A changing government now will not bring any change in how this country is run if you pick Labour over the Tories, nor this country's attitude towards other states and other people. If we want change, we cannot be voting Labour any more than we'd contemplate voting Tory. Because right now there is zero difference, and I don't think that is likely to change. Voting intention amongst Muslim voters might just be shifting, and we all need to think likewise too, perhaps. I covered the inception of the Muslim vote the other day in more detail, how quickly they have grown, how organised they are, and they really ought to be terrifying Labour, given how many seats they can influence, and fully intend to do that, how equipped they are to do that. And you should absolutely watch this video next to learn all about that. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Israel have just bombed Belgian property in the Gaza Strip, and when it comes hot on the heels of Belgium being one of those countries committing to continuing to fund UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees, it does seem like a revenge attack by Israel on Belgium for refusing to go along with whatever Israel demands, as so many other countries do, that they're so used to other countries do. Other countries that can't fall over themselves fast enough to do anything that Israel wants. UNRWA have existed since 1949. They look after the needs of some 6 million displaced Palestinians right now across Gaza, across the West Bank, and across other nations in the Middle East as well. Yet they're facing financial ruin, along with the cost in human life that will come with that, because of accusations that are already crumbling by Israel that some of UNRWA's workers in Gaza, 4 individuals as it stands, amongst a workforce there of 15,000, that helped Hamas on the night of October 7th. That weak, evidenceless, Israel's word for it only accusation has been enough for 16 countries to shamelessly defund UNRWA entirely on their parts. Something Israel would dearly love to see, as they see UNRWA as the barrier between Palestinians staying in their lands or voluntarily leaving, unable to survive there. So this strike against Belgium by Israel, well, you might not have heard much about it because the mainstream media have completely ignored this. But that's likely because whatever level of justification you might see Israel as having, attacking foreign-owned property in the Strip, it's going to be a hard one to defend yourself against, isn't it? Right, so what's happening to Belgium then, Damo? Well, On the 1st of February, or we think on the 1st of February, it might have been the 31st of January, Israel bombed the offices of the Belgian Agency for Development Cooperation in Gaza. This was a 6-story building that stood in the Al Rimmel district of, well, frankly, what's left of Gaza City at this point of time in the north of the Gaza Strip. You might be surprised that anything, frankly, is still standing in Gaza City nearly 4 months into the genocide. But that also somewhat underlines the possible and certainly right now heavily discussed motive Israel might have had to hit this particular building now, especially when they are supposedly focused in southern Gaza in Khan Yunis and planning on moving even further south, hitting Rafah on the border with Egypt, where all displaced Palestinians have been sent to with nowhere else to go anymore. Well, the Belgian offices there housed 2 entities, the Belgian Development Agency called Enable, good name, and a non-governmental organisation called Humanity and Inclusion. To give you an idea of what they're about, Enable's mission statement reads, Enable is the development agency of the Belgian federal government, implementing Belgium's international development policy. Under the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, we carry out public service assignments in Belgium and abroad. We provide customised expertise, including Belgian public expertise. We promote the involvement of all partners and we pursue top-level partnerships. Enable also enhances the impact of Belgium in international development by carrying out assignments for Belgian and international third-party commissions. A bit blurby, but you get the idea. It's international development. Humanity and Inclusion was formerly known as Handicap International, and they're an aid agency working in situations of poverty and exclusion, conflict and disaster. So it's fairly obvious that here we have 2 Belgian agencies, government-linked at that, working hand-in-hand with each other to deliver aid and redevelopment to the people of the Gaza Strip. Certainly something in and of itself that Israel would have had beef with, given they are now levelling Gaza, as we know, and with Israeli government ministers openly talking about relocating people of Gaza so that they can take the land for themselves. Well, following Belgium's public support for UNRWA and their pledge to continue funding the valuable work that aid agency does, clearly working alongside the aid agencies that Belgium itself is funding in Gaza separately. So this isn't a sudden bucking of the trend here. Belgium have been working in Gaza on some humanitarian level for some time. Their 6-story offices suddenly got levelled by Israel, bombing it, it's thought on the 31st of January or maybe early on the 1st of February, since the offices were known to be standing on the 30th of January, but they definitely weren't by the 1st. Israel conveniently opting to take the building out despite knowing it was empty. So it needs saying that there have been no fatalities associated with this strike. The 74 people who apparently once worked there were quite understandably evacuated from Gaza City some time ago. But the 31st of January, incidentally, was also the same day that Benjamin Netanyahu stood up and made a speech reiterating Israel's long-held call for UNRWA to have its mandate ended. Well, with 6 million people reliant on UNRWA for support, what happens to them then? Israel don't care. And it seems that anyone that does care, well, they'll be prevented from being able to do anything about it, as seems to be the motivation in bombing this Belgian building. Belgium's reaction is one of shock and being utterly appalled, as you can imagine. Their foreign minister, Angela Rayner, posted on Twitter that attacks on civilian infrastructure breach the principles of international humanitarian law. All parties must adhere. Quite right too. The Belgian Foreign Office is also looking at making Israel cough up for damages over this strike, as they absolutely should be, with the Foreign Ministry statement reading, Belgium will put the issue of compensation for the damaged infrastructure of projects financed by the EU and its member states back on the agenda of a next European consultation. Indeed, they haven't hung around demanding answers from Israel over this hit either. The following day, after news had reached them that their building had been bombed, yesterday, as that was at time of writing, the Israeli ambassador to Belgium, Idit Rosenzweig Abu, was summoned, or convoked as it is called in diplomatic circles, regarding the destruction of the Enable office building, though thus far no news has come out of what was said in that meeting. Rosenzweig Abu put out a tweet on the 1st of February, coincidentally though, which I sincerely hope she was asked about the following day at that meeting when she was pulled before the Foreign Office in Belgium, which read, from the UN itself, there are other agencies that can take over UNRWA's role if funds are redirected to them. The major defunding donors knew that. They knew as they are actually involved on the ground and know Gaza. There are other humanitarian solutions that are not collaborating with Hamas. I wonder if she was talking about enable or humanity and inclusion there then. Bad timing if so. Besides, doesn't the strike on the Belgian offices just show that anyone who tries to take over the work of UNRWA just ends up with a target on them too? Or will any such replacement have to have Israel's seal of approval? That sounds more like it, doesn't it? That'd make for a very trustworthy organisation, wouldn't it? Not. The day before, on the 31st of January, Ambassador Rosenzweig Abu even attacked the country she's ambassador to, sharing this image, saying 11 of UNRWA's top 20 donors suspended funding. 9 didn't, but which 9? And highlighted Belgium amongst them. If I was smack-talking your country that I'm a guest in, that I'm supposed to be doing a job of strengthening relations between, I'd expect to be expelled without my backside touching the floor. It may have happened by now for all we know. The Belgian Vivaldi coalition government have taken a much more Israel-critical stance, and this apparently has led to clashes with said ambassador, which have apparently left those involved shocked at times. Whatever has happened in that meeting then, I can imagine it was deeply unpleasant for the deeply unpleasant ambassador. Equally though, Israel has attacked the property of yet another sovereign state, what seems a really petulant attack, because it dares to keep funding an aid agency they don't like. Their word not good enough for Belgium, when Israel's words on anything frankly shouldn't be good enough for anybody, not without ample amounts of proof and evidence. Will Belgium drag Israel to court over this maybe? They ought to. Criminal damage. Building unoccupied. No doubt Israel will say Hamas have been using the building for a weapons cache again, or something similar, the usual excuses, but without evidence because we never see any. More likely every bit the sulky revenge attack it looks to be, in which case. This is yet one more example as to why Israel needs taking to court and needs to be held to account, the same level of accountability that every other nation on earth would be held to, and not be constantly acquiesced to, and no leader bending over for them is one worth voting for here, going into a general election. But equally, Israel's accusations against UNRWA, as their finger pointing at others so often does, is already crumbling. The number of actual cases warranting investigation having fallen from an already pathetic 12 out of 15,000 to just 4 due to, well, funnily enough, a lack of evidence. You should watch this video here to get the details of that and ask yourself, what do you do? Why on earth our leaders are so stupid as to believe any of this and cut funding on the back of it? Or more to the point, why they think we're stupid enough to believe it too? And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.